So welcome everyone from around the globe. I'm Martin Golumbik, chairman of the International Symposium on Artificial Intelligence and Mathematics. Together with my colleagues, Frederick Hoffman and Dimitrios Yukonos, we are happy to have all of you with us for this final event of ISAIM 2022, an interview with Judea Pearl by Stephen Wolfram.
Great. Well,
Judea is best known for championing the probabilistic approach to artificial intelligence, the development of Bayesian networks, and his theory of causality and counterfactual inference based on structural models. Judea was honored for his fundamental contributions by receiving the Turing Award in 2011, the highest distinction in computer science. Through his books on heuristics, causality, and most recently the Book of Why, aimed at the general public, which I have on my bedstand, Judea has influenced several generations of AI researchers. Since the founding of this symposium in 1990, Judea has been an active speaker at the conference and an editor of the journal Annals of Math and AI, that is our sister publication. We are therefore very pleased to be celebrating his 85th birthday with today's interview. And on a personal note, in 1977, Judea and I were office mates at the Weizmann Institute. I was a postdoc and he was on his first sabbatical. Stephen Wolfram is the creator of Mathematica, also Wolfram Alpha and the Wolfram language. He's the author of A New Kind of Science and the founder and CEO of Wolfram Research. And as you'll see today, Stephen is definitely the right person to intellectually challenge us all and to bring out both his and Judea's perspective in all aspects of science, mathematics, logic, computation, and so forth. So thank you, Judea and Stephen, for being with us at the International Symposium for AI and Mathematics here in cyberspace 2022.
thanks very much.
Thank you, Marty.
Well, it's an honor for me to get to do this 85th birthday interview. And first, we should say happy birthday to Judea. I know it's a little bit past your birthday, but happy birthday and many happy returns and so on. So what I hope to do is to talk a little bit about kind of the journey of your life and career, but I wanted to maybe start off talking a bit about some science, partly because I've heard about your causal graphs for a really long time. I think I've used them in various ways at various times, but it's in my life of trying to study things like fundamental physics, I've also encountered causal graphs, and people have asked me a bunch of times, how do your causal graphs relate to Judea Pearl's causal graphs? And I wasn't sure I knew the answer to that. I think I just figured out the answer to that. And the answer is fairly interesting. But maybe we can start off just trying to understand a little bit about your kind of causal graphs and so on. And maybe I can put up a picture, which I think is your picture. Let me see here. Maybe I can just ask a little bit about this. So is this, just to check, identity check, this is one of your kind of causal graphs, yes?
Yes, it was configured at the time that I didn't know anything about causality, except for intuition that this is how we think. But this was in the day of Bayesian network, which is purely probabilistic mathematical object.
Okay, but so as I understand it, I can think about what's happening here. This alarm thing is kind of like a function. It takes two inputs. It either says this has happened, this hasn't happened, and the same with this one, and then it produces two outputs. Is that a fair way to say it?
Correct. Actually, the name in the ellipse here is the name of a variable and proposition. So alarm can be either on and off. So it's a variable. Earthquake can be on and off. So it's not an event, it's a variable.
What's the difference between those? I mean, in other words, if it's on or off, isn't that saying, isn't that, could I not think of this as being a function that takes as input the state of this burglary thing, the burglary variable, so to speak, and the state of this earthquake variable, and then computes output, which it then feeds to these nodes? Is that
absolutely
reasonable?
correct? Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And so then what's happening here is that this function is not a deterministic function of its inputs. It's a function of its inputs that has certain probabilities for producing the outputs it's going to produce. Is that right?
Correct. Yes. But so the probabilities, the conditional probabilities, are given here in the table. Okay. So it's not, as you see, ones and zeros. So it is not a deterministic OR gate. If it was deterministic, it would be just an OR gate, right? But it's not OR function. It has some noise, which means that alarm could be triggered by other unknown factors in the universe.
Right. But I mean, in a sense, if once it has its value, it's triggered or not, it's then going to feed that value to these nodes here.
Feed forward, yes.
Yes, but the question of whether it's triggered is a probabilistic function of its inputs.
Correct.
And so just to understand, I mean, if this was sort of classical statistics, instead of this being a kind of small directed, acyclic graph, this would be a complete graph, and we'd be talking about tables of conditional probabilities for everything depending on everything. Is that right?
If it was orthodox probability, then you'll have a table of 5 variables, right? And for each combination of values, you'll have a number. The probability that conjunction of the state of the 5 variables is prevails. You'll have a number, and you have a 2 to the 5 long table.
Right. But then, so could I potentially, in the way you've set it up, if I made a complete graph that just says how, so you're saying that's different from just having a complete graph of something like this?
Yeah, it's because it conveys some information. The fact that burglary is not connected here to earthquake imposes a condition that burglary is independent on earthquake. The fact that there is missing link between the two.
Right. But what I'm saying is, if we filled in every link, if we made this a complete graph where every node is connected to every other node,
okay,
then we would have something which would we then have something which corresponds to traditional kind of classical probability, or would we have something different?
What is traditional classical probability? You specify a probability model by what? I'm used to, in my high school, they told me I have a table of 32 entries, and each entry has a number, and the number sum to 1. This is a probabilistic model of 5 variables, binary variables. Okay? Is that what you mean by traditional probability model?
That's what I mean. Yes, that's what I mean.
Okay, good. Yeah. But this is not, this is, we can construct the table from this graph. Yes.
Sure. And it will have a bunch of zeros in it.
It will have a bunch, not of zeros, but a certain constraints. For instance, the fact that burglary is independent on earthquake will amount to a certain relationship among the entries in the table, which are not obvious.
But so when you prune from that everything depends on everything to this kind of causal structure, I'm curious whether the primary source of pruning is time.
No, time is not participate in our judgment of whether who depends on whom, but it's not in the graph itself.
But in the actuality of how these dependencies occur, is it not the case that most of that, the reason why something depends on something, but it doesn't, why there's that sequence of dependencies is because things follow each other in time.
All I say is time is a constraint. Never say that a cause follows in time of the effect. Okay, that is a constraint, which constrains our judgment. But it's not in the. That's the reason why we put an arrow between earthquake and alarm, and not the other way around.
Because time goes that way.
Correct. Okay,
right.
That's correct. But time alone could not account for the directionality of the arrows.
But what I'm curious about is insofar as causality and causal graphs and so on are important in practice, is the primary reason for that because there is a definite flow of time?
It's not the primary, it's a secondary. It's a heuristic.
Okay.
I give you an example. My canonical example is that the rooster crow doesn't cause the sun to rise, even though it occurs before the sun, right?
Well, okay, but fair enough. But the rooster presumably has a circadian rhythm. I don't exactly know what causes roosters to start crowing. One would assume that it is something that is dependent on a thing that happened in the world prior to when the rooster started to crow.
Correct, yeah.
So in a sense, although, I mean, there is a time element to that, although the particular event you've chosen is not one that has that time causal dependence.
Correct. So there are hidden variables which satisfy our notion that causes always precede its effect. Yes. Here they satisfy and explain why the rooster crow occurs before the sunrise, even though it doesn't affect the sunrise. Okay. So there are hidden variables like the length of the glow in the atmosphere. Okay.
Right. But I guess the thing that I was trying to understand, because, I've used things that I call causal graphs for like 30 years in thinking about fundamental physics.
Show me one.
Yeah, sure. Here we go. There's a typical causal graph. Let's see if I can find a smaller one. They're big. In fact, the one that I think the story of our universe is basically can be told in a causal graph with 10 to the 500 nodes. How big are your biggest causal graphs?
The largest one I've seen is the 30 variables.
Okay. Well, we're dealing with 10 to the 500 variables in this case. So it's kind of a very bulk causal graph. Let's see if I can find a more, let's see.
No.
Yeah, this is a typical.
That's good.
So this is a typical causal graph where each yellow dot is an event, and these are deterministic graphs. That is, this event happens, it enables the possibility for this event. You can think of these events as being like functions that are taking certain inputs, and the event can only happen when those inputs are available from previous events. So
why do you have two arrows there? We have two arrows going between two events, yeah.
Right. Because there are sort of two carriers of causality. There are two different pieces of input that this event will need that it has to get from that event. Let's see if I can find a better example here. Let me see.
No, I begin to understand it. It's great.
Here, let me try and find a let's see, events and their causal relationships. That might be relevant. This is a typical example. So these are again a little bit different from your setup. These are states, these blue things, and the yellow things are events that are transforming, that represent transformations from one state to another. And so, for example, in this state here, there are three events that can happen. These are string rewriting systems. So there are three possible rewritings that can happen. There are three rewritings that can be done on this string, and that produces three different states. And so there's causal dependence because a rewriting can't happen until the input for that rewriting has already been produced by a previous event.
Mhm.
And so let's see. Let's see if I can find a better example here. Sorry, I was prepared to talk about your things, but not my things. Let me just see whether I can find a good example here. Let's see. Okay, well, this is a very trivial causal graph, in which each event just takes two inputs and produces two outputs. And for me, one of the things which I don't know whether it comes up in your kind of setup, but for me, one of the things that's important is how do you decide which events can be happening simultaneously? How do you decide that this defines a partial order on events?
Yeah.
And there's a question of how you get, how you think about what events can be simultaneous. And in the interpretation of this in physics, relativity is the story of basically being able to pick different foliations of this causal graph, different choices for what we consider to be the events that are happening at the same time.
Yeah.
But these are deterministic graphs. But the thing that I realized, and perhaps I feel, let's see if I can find one here. I think this might be, oh dear. There are a lot of graphs. Sorry, there are just a lot of kinds of graphs here. The thing that, yeah, here we go. No, that was the thing. Here, I can show you just and then I want to get off talking about my kind of causal graphs. But I just to let you know that causal graphs, at least some version of them, are important in physics, I think. So we talked about a causal graph where there are events that happen and they enable other events to happen. There is a different and more complicated concept, which I just realized is related to what you're doing, which are what we call multi-way causal graphs. And let's see how best to explain this. Imagine that you have a game and there's a game graph that represents all these different possible moves that can take place in the game. And that there are many possible paths you can go through. And now say, let's that whole collection of possible paths represents what we call a multi-way graph. And you can make a graph of causal relationships from that. Like you can say you can't, in order to be able to make this move, you have to have made this move first. And so you can make this causal graph of all these different possible games and possible histories for the game. So that's a deterministic graph. That whole thing is just a big game graph. But now if you start kind of saying, well, actually, I'm not going to look at the details of where every piece was. I'm just going to compress it to something probabilistic. I think that ends up being a graph like your graphs.
I doubt it. I doubt it. I've done some work, in game graphs. These are and/or graphs, and they are the nodes correspond to events or position of the game, essentially position of the board.
Yeah. So right, but the thing is, maybe we're going to get ourselves into too technical a discussion here. Maybe this is here. Let me show you an example, perhaps, of let's see if I can find a simpler example, and then I want to get on to talking about well.
Then we talk about graphs.
What's that?
And then we talk about real graphs.
What's that? Okay, this is the thing. What's happening in something like this? This is an example of one of these multi-way graphs. You could do this for a game. You can do it for string rewriting. It's just saying with the rules that we're using here, we get to have multiple different possible outcomes from that state, right? And
yeah, well, this very much like a game graph. You see, from this, each one of that could happen, right? And all the parents must happen before we get the sun. That's the idea.
Yes.
That's why we call it and/or graph.
Okay.
Right? Okay, that's very much like a game graph. Yeah.
It is. Yes.
I'm familiar with it. Yes. It
Okay.
has almost nothing to do with the kind of graph that evolved in Bayesian networks, or the kind of graph which define causal models.
I'm not sure that's right. I think.
No, although they can be unfolded, okay? Which means if you take, each one of the causal graph can be unfolded according to what's happened in the universe. Okay? So it's essentially a condensed version of an and/or graph.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly so. Right. I mean, so each possible sequence
trajectory.
of right. Each possible trajectory is, but what you're doing, that's exactly the thing that it took me until this morning to figure out, is that you could take one of these, as you're calling it, unrolled graphs, and you can compress, you can basically project it so that you're ignoring this kind of what we call the branchial direction, the different possible histories direction, and get something which just has, where you can just account for it in terms of probabilities. Now, presumably, there are additional effects that you can get if you were to trace all those deterministic paths that you would not capture purely in having an independent probability at each node.
I'm not sure, because
I think
we just said that a causal graph are parsimonious representation for all possible trajectories.
Right, but they have probabilities. What you're doing is you're taking all those possible paths, and you're summarizing all paths that come into a particular node, and all paths that come out. You're summarizing that by a probability, by a conditional probability. And there is actually more information. I mean, this will be like, imagine that these were like molecules in a gas or something, and they were interacting. Then it's still the case that there's sort of additional information that is being carried that wouldn't be part of wouldn't be accounted for just in the conditional probabilities. I think anyway that this is I think that the effects that you get are, in the formalism that we have, for example, the kinds of effects that you would get are the effects that correspond to things in quantum mechanics that are different from the things that you get from classical probability. And I think that that's what you get if you take those additional threads rather than compressing things into probabilities. I had not intended to get anything like this.
No, but good. But you see, Stefan, when we talk about mathematical objects, I find it very useful to concentrate on two things. One, where does the information come from? What do you have to ask yourself when you construct the graph? Okay. To decide whether the arrow goes one way, whether there is an arrow or no, you have to ask yourself a question. What are those questions? That's number one. Second, why you play this game? What kind of query do you want the graph to answer for you? That's another criteria. That defines the mathematical object. So in this case, for instance, the purpose of putting it down, because we have an important question to ask. Mary called me. What's the probability there is a burglary in my house? Okay, so I want this device to do the calculus for me and to give me the answer with speed and credibility, in coherence, and to comply with my input. This is my input. Now I'm asking you a different question. What is the probability that I have burglary? Mary called me. Assuming, So I want this query, which is conditional probability, to be computed from this object.
Right.
So I'm
No,
giving you
it's a very elegant summary of what would otherwise be a kind of a mess of equations and things like that.
Correct. Yeah. It's just a parsimonious way of answering the query and representing your knowledge.
In a sense, it feels like the kind of thing which, you know, if one had started, if statistics had happened after people knew about computing and knew about kind of mathematical logic and functions in that area and so on, maybe they would have invented this before classical statistics.
I'm sure about it.
So, I mean, in a sense, the you know, what had become before classical statistics was the idea of mathematical equations, which are very two-way, this is related to that kind of thing, as opposed to what we're more used to in programming, where it's more, you've got this input, now you're going to get that output. I mean, is that kind of a reasonable way of kind of summarizing the input to output is kind of the sort of the causal graph kind of thinking, as opposed to just this is related to this with some kind of equality as a more traditional statistics thinking?
Yeah, it doesn't happen here.
I got rid of that. I decided shall I? I'll reshare that.
The special thing about this game, which is Bayesian network, right, is you rely on human knowledge. It doesn't happen very much in statistics, you know, because as you remember, the Royal Statistical Society in 1831 has declared all judgment to be taboo, which means we are going to publish only data and data and data and no opinion. It says so. And this is contrary to that. It says, I want to tap the knowledge of an expert and put it down in a parsimonious way, convenient way, and get answers that answer would have answered had he had time to go through traditional probability. So here's the new element here is we are trying to get human judgment on the paper.
I mean,
yeah,
but I mean, in a sense, one could have said that in classical statistics if one said, okay, there's some set of variables and we're going to assume this doesn't depend on that. We're going to put our judgment in the fact that there's this otherwise joint probability distribution of everything has no dependence of this on that and so on. I mean, that seems to be more a cultural decision of a field to say, you know, don't just put all the variables in there and see how the data implies they're related. I mean, and also presumably is a very ill-formed problem. I mean, presumably that's something that, given the data, the inversion is vastly more difficult than it is in a more parsimonious setup of the kind that you have.
Well, yeah, that's correct. Yes.
I mean,
I don't recall in the history of statistics the question of we assume that certain variables are independent. And in what context could have this have been utilized? I don't think it applies to life expectancy, where statistics developed in the late 18th century. Now, where does the idea of independence?
I'm sure that must have been known to people like Fisher when they were doing their agricultural
Fisher,
experiments.
it's much later. That's in 1930s.
Right. But I mean, but the idea of, well, for example, people certainly discussed independence in games of chance and in random walks and so on. Was this, was it an independent, were these successive throws of the dice or something independent?
Yeah. Okay,
so I think that must have been known to the Bernoullis, this idea of independence.
Absolutely, yes. Bernoulli already assumed independence of a coin flip, yes.
But so they must have had, I suspect if one goes back and looks at kind of the probabilistic analysis of games of chance, that they must have had some knowledge of what was dependent, what was independent there.
Correct. But I think conditional independence didn't occur to them until Beige, right, which is 1763.
Right.
Interesting.
But his work, as I understand it, was I mean, was not centrally ingested into the kind of corpus of mathematics for a long time. I mean, it was just a kind of oh, by the way, there's this interesting result. Is that a fair assessment, or or did it seem like it got into mathematics in a more serious way? I mean, I'd always
Laplace made a big fuss about Bayesian statistics. So.
Aha. What was he using it for?
For his query.
Actually, he talked about Laplace's demon. He was interested in this question of whether, if you know in principle sort of all of the positions of all the atoms in the universe, could you predict the future? So he may have been interested there in questions about, if you know the future, what can you infer about the past and so on? Because he was.
I'm not sure it came in this context, but in 1812 he had a treatise on probability where he expounded on Bayes' theory and made it into a body of a full body of mathematical analysis. Yeah.
But so I'm curious, and maybe we should start. Maybe we should talk about your life and times and the causal graph that led you to do causal graphs, so to speak.
Okay.
Well,
it went through several generations. So where do you want to start?
Let's start at the very beginning. So let's do the personal history. I mean, so where did you grow up?
I grew up in a little town called Bnei Brak, which my grandfather happened to establish in 1924, about 7.5 miles from Tel Aviv. And that was a fairly religious town, a replicate of a Jewish shtetl in Poland, where they came from. And I was born in 1936, in the middle of the conflict, and in the beginning of the Holocaust. So I was part of both conflict and nation building. And I was very lucky. They always paid tribute to my professors in my high school and in college as well. These were a bunch of geniuses, and I was lucky, not only me, my entire generation was lucky to be beneficiaries of the most daring educational experiments of human history.
So what was so I'm curious, the town that you grew up in, was it an industrialized town? Was it mostly an agricultural kind of thing?
Agricultural, yes. But this was a special kind of agricultural by people who knew nothing about agriculture. Okay.
They were highly educated, but not in agriculture. Was that the picture?
They were merchants, middlemen, came from Poland, and they had to change occupation, of course, because they had to grow radishes. That was a vegetable that was the fastest growing thing. It takes 4 days for radish to start. And that's how they started. Then they went to dairy, and then they sent my grandfather to Damascus to buy cows because they didn't like the Palestinian cows. They had to buy Syrian cows. So he came back bleeding and tired, just with one cow from the 5 that he bought in Damascus. All the rest ran away. Okay. It's an old story. The point
so did that one cow turn into many cows, or did that one cow?
Oh yes, she was the best milk giving in the whole town. Yes.
I'm curious, what kinds of names did cows get in those days in that area?
Depends by whom. we named her, the town named her Zeresh. Now, Zeresh was the wife of Haman. Haman was the evil guy in the story of Esther, if you know your Bible, right?
I do not know it well enough to know that.
Because these were deeply traditional Jews who established the town, and everything that happened had a historical connotation, had to have connection to the history. For instance, the name of the town is mentioned in the Exodus Haggadah that we read in the Passover. This was a place where the 5 rabbis sat and told the story of Exodus, and the disciples came and told them, hush, hush, the Romans are coming. Okay, so it's time to stop. Everything was connected to Bible or the history up to the exile. Yeah. So I grew up in this atmosphere that we are returning to the birthplace of our history.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So when you said that in school you were part of an experiment, what kind of educational theory was your high school kind of based on some, or schools based on some kind of particular educational approach?
Yeah, both approach, and but most importantly, the people. My high school teachers were professors in Germany before they had to leave Germany, Heidelberg and Berlin, and they came to for Israel, and they couldn't find another job except in teaching high school. Okay, so the experiment, the educational experiment that I am a beneficiary of, was to find university professors who teach high school, okay, knowing that they will never write a paper again, and they will never go to a laboratory again, and that we are the embodiment, the implementation of the embodiment of their dreams, scientific dreams. So you have both a dedication here combined with knowledge. And wow, that was knowledge. Each one of them was a polyglot, could speak without note on any subject, okay? From geography to history to mathematics. So I was.
Why do you say they would never publish papers again? Were they not? I mean, although they were teaching high school by day, presumably they had. Was there a reason why they didn't feel that they wanted or were able to continue whatever their research was?
I think life at those times did not permit that luxury. They had to make a living for their families. These times were not easy, and none of them had any. No, their spare time they spent with us. They even had little groups of students that they invited home to their home for special and advanced studies. Okay? We were the object of their dreams.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what
how old were your professors typically? Were they in their early part of their careers, or were they?
No, they were 30, 40, 50 years old. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so what had they been professors of? Like the ones who were teaching you more technical subjects, what had they been professors of before?
Of physics, of mathematics, of philosophy. One of them was professor for literature, but they knew every subject. It's not, yeah. That's how they taught in Germany at the time, I guess.
And what language were they teaching in at your school?
Hebrew. Everything was in Hebrew. Yeah.
And people had, I should know my history better, but I mean, Hebrew was sort of a reconstructed language, how did they come to, when were people learning Hebrew?
People learn Hebrew even in Germany. It's part of the Haskalah, the Enlightenment. But it was in Germany, it was mainly a literary language. You study it when you want to read something, not spoken, but when they came to Israel, it was so common and popular. There's no other language except Hebrew when you want to communicate with all the many, the people from many countries.
But so how did there end up
available.
being words for mathematical concepts and physics concepts?
Beautiful.
And so on?
We had a committee called Vad Halashon, which convened weekly, and they generated new words and new terms, right?
Okay.
Electron remain electron, but what can I say? I can't recall now. Technical words that were invented periodically, okay, to meet the needs as they develop, right?
So the other student, go ahead, sir.
No, you asked me also about the method of teaching, which was different than conventional. They taught us chronologically and not logically, in the sense that for every theorem or every geometrical construction, they name the philosopher or the Greek scientist that is responsible for that theorem, Thales and Euclid and Cheva, and the time that he or she lived, it was mainly he, lived, what was known at the time, what were the questions asked in the time, and sometimes even his family relationship. Like we knew everything about Archimedes in his time and his wife. So it was.
I didn't know anything about Archimedes' wife. I
know
a little bit about Archimedes, but Pythagoras had a famous wife.
I don't know her. I haven't met her. So it was a storytelling, identifying with the individual, and then comes the theorem, which means the theorem was a product of man's struggle with the mysteries of science, as opposed to a recipe. And that's what made me connected with the theorems and the constructions. Yeah.
So did the students kind of take away the idea these things were created by people, so we could create these kinds of things too?
Absolutely. That was their trick of telling us you can invent another proof of Pythagoras' theorems. Unknown proof. You can do it. We all got this idea that mathematics has not been completed, has not been sealed, okay? But we have the capacity to generate another proof that the cube cannot be
trisected or something. No, duplicated.
Duplicated, right, yeah. And each one of us got this illusion that we can also contribute something to this long chain of mathematical development.
That's great. I mean, in one of the criticisms that has been sometimes leveled at that kind of teaching is when you teach something like physics, you sort of just about make it into sometime in the 1800s, and then you kind of run out of steam, so to speak. Did that? I mean, in an area like philosophy, probably what was said 2,000 years ago is still very much what should be said today, but it's less clear in some other areas. Was that kind of an issue, or was that? I mean, is it like is it like, well, they got up to 1850 in this subject, and then you never learnt the things after 1850, or did that not happen?
No, we didn't get to advanced mathematics in the high school, but
so, for example, an area like discrete mathematics was comparatively new, but not terribly advanced. So was that an example of something that kind of didn't make the cut because of sort of a historical approach, or I mean, I don't know whether probably nobody was teaching discrete mathematics yet
I didn't learn any discrete mathematics in high school, nor in college. We learned what we needed to have to understand Maxwell equation, but we didn't do discrete mathematics.
So what became of the? I mean, how big were the classes in your schools, and what became of some of the other students? Did they go on to distinguished careers and things?
Yes, many of my classmates were successful in different parts, different in sciences and in business. And for instance, Daniel Kahneman happened to be in the same high school that I am. I just found out about a year ago that he was in the same high school a year before me.
Yeah. Interesting. So then after high school, did you go to college directly or did you?
After high school, I joined a youth movement with the idea that I'm going to be a kibbutznik, I'm a member of the kibbutz, and I'm going to spend my life in the ideal communal environment and live proper life, okay, according to the ideals of every socialist philosopher that I read.
Which were the main socialist philosophers you read?
Of course, Marx and Engels, and well, it wasn't really it was those pioneers, Zionist pioneers, that established the state, which brought with them from Russia the Bolshevik ideology, but humanized. Okay? They were part of the socialist generation that is responsible for the 1917 revolution. Okay? But they escaped there before that and started things like dat avodah, which means the religion of work, okay? Which means there is holiness in producing, in just working, occupying yourself and generating and building a little village here and there. Okay? So they really established the culture of my generation. They established kibbutzim and moshavim. Kibbutzim means the plural of a kibbutz, okay? And a kibbutz was to be a model society. And that really prevailed most of my youth. Okay? This idea that we are here to generate a model society. So I grew
Was that
up,
a common view? I mean, among your classmates, was everybody kind of in this, we're going to do the kibbutz thing, or were there people who were like?
No. Society was divided into several segments. This was part of it. I went to a kindergarten for children of workers. Okay, so I marched in May 1st, which is the International Day of Socialist Day. Okay, but different classmates of mine went to different schools, and they were more traditional, more religious, and so on. We had several, but we had a mixture. In my hometown, we had a mixture of extreme right and extreme left, and they all lived together and accommodated. At that time, they could tolerate each other. I don't think they can do it today. Yeah.
Your parents must have made the decision to send you to the kind of the workers' kindergarten.
Only up to second grade. Second grade, they moved me to the more traditional religious school. Yeah.
What did your parents do? What was their occupation?
Well, my father was a city clerk, city secretary. Okay, he took notes of the meetings, and my mother was just a housewife, and she later on opened women clothing stores.
Did you have siblings?
Yes, I have one sister, and one brother which I lost. He died early in the 1980s.
So are you the oldest, or are you in the middle?
I'm the oldest, yes. I'm the oldest.
Uh-huh.
So I was supposed to represent all my mother's dream, namely to be a doctor or a lawyer. Yes.
Aha.
And when I went to the kibbutz, it was a crisis for her.
What had she been educated in a particular kind of?
No, she wasn't educated in any formal way. I don't believe she finished high school. No. She learned a trade, sewing. And she made a living by sewing dresses to more well-to-do families in their private houses. Yeah.
So was being a doctor or a lawyer, I mean, was that the same as it is today? Kind of those were the kind of the cool professions, so to speak?
Yes, but she wouldn't mind if I became a professor. That's I know that she would have liked it. Yeah.
So, okay, so at the end of high school, you are about to be involved with the kibbutz. So what happened?
Oh, the idea was to go to the army, and with the youth movement framework, namely that we spent time on a kibbutz, part military training and part agricultural work, and then we stay in the kibbutz for the rest of our life. That was the path. Okay, I did the first part, and I didn't stay in the kibbutz all my life. Somebody told me at the end of my army service that if you like mathematics, you better take electrical engineering in the technion, and that's what I did.
So which year was this by now? What?
That was 1953. In 1953, I started the army service. I left in 1956, and then I joined the technion. Yeah.
So did you have the opportunity to do kind of mathematical things in the army, or were you doing traditional?
No, I just grew apples.
You just grew apples?
Yes.
But
I worked in the apple plant.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yes. And so what was I mean, had you already become enthusiastic about mathematics? So what were the subjects that you were enthusiastic about in high school?
No, I wasn't enthusiastic. I went deep in everything that we learned. I knew I was interested. And I think I remember my trauma when we first learned about the analytic geometry. It was really a shock to me that you can do these things in two different languages. I remember having a fever, for sure. I now retrospectively attributed to Descartes, but at that time too, I thought it's impossible, to do all these constructions to prove that the triangle has 180 degrees algebraically. It was unheard of for me. And I thought that Descartes was the greatest mathematician that ever lived because of this meeting of the two languages. So that was one of the fascination I had. And,
but so I'm curious. Often when people end up doing making big progress in some area of science or something like that, they can kind of look back and they can say, well, actually, when I was a kid, I was interested in such and such, and that resonates with the thing I ended up doing later. Are there things like that for you?
No, I cannot pin it down. I cannot pin it down. I knew I had deep interest in every subject, but I cannot say this was a moment where I thought, oh, I should be more interested in that, or I should go and take this kind of career. Never happened to me. No, I know only that my teachers knew about me more than I knew about myself. I didn't have self-confidence. I was surprised that even my teachers knew my name. One time, a teacher invited my mother and said, "Oh, what did I do wrong?" Okay, and she came back and said, "The teacher said you're doing well." I said, he knows my name? It was a surprise to me. And then he told her, Mrs. Pearl, sell everything you have, but give him education. Give him education. Okay. And I was surprised that he thinks that highly about me when I didn't have the confidence myself. But my mother took it seriously.
What was the background of that teacher? Was that teacher one of the ones who'd been a professor in Germany?
No, that was in grade school. In grade school, he just taught us physics. I remember he taught us Pascal laws in liquids. Oh, beautiful stuff! I can still memorize it.
So, if you studied philosophy, you must have heard the word causality in your studies in philosophy when you were a kid, or not?
Hardly. No.
Did you study kind of the traditional sequence of kind of the Greek philosophers and up through Descartes and Hume and all these kinds of people?
Only in history. In the history class, we went over the Greek tradition, went to the British empiricists, and so on. But part of history, not part of philosophy. We didn't have any class in philosophy, which I'm really sorry. What else?
It's not a very common subject for people to teach in schools, I think, in most countries in the world.
Yeah, even in college, we didn't have a class in the history of science, which is bad. But in every class, we had a bit of stories about the inventor about Faraday, about Maxwell, had a little bit about their time and personality. Yeah.
That's interesting. So you went to the Technion. The Technion must have been very new at that point. When was
no. Technion was established I think in 1912.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes.
Older than I knew. Okay.
Right. Yes, and it was a big debate whether the teaching language is going to be German or Hebrew. And the Hebrew advocates prevailed. And then, it was a tremendous job and burden on the Committee for Language to generate all the terminology that is needed. Yeah. But it started very early, and then with the influx of immigration from Germany in the 1930s, it really took off.
So what was the subject that what was your major in college?
Electrical engineering.
Okay.
With electronic option. Which means we focus more on electronic as opposed to power.
So, but this was still vacuum tubes, yes?
Yes. Vacuum. I'm still using a vacuum tube.
Oh yeah, what for?
I have a terminal here, which is electron beam.
Oh yeah, right. A CRT.
A CRT.
Cathode ray tube.
A cathode ray tube. I love it because number one, it reminds me of the Technion, and number two, these are real electrons, not light emitting diodes.
I see. Okay, so when you were studying, I mean, like, triodes and things were your friends. I mean, this was
yes.
And were you doing actual electronics and building things and so on, or was it more theoretical?
We had project of building things, amplifiers, feedback control system, in a laboratory. But everything was vacuum tube. The transistor just came about at that time. Right. We had one class in semiconductors, and the transistor was, I didn't see a transistor until I came here.
Okay. Did you see a computer before you, was there a computer at Technion?
There wasn't, no. We had a class in computers before we saw a computer. We all understood that this is the future. We had one class by Yoeli had to do more with Boolean algebra and metagim, which mean relay networks, and how to synthesize Boolean functions with gates. Okay. That was the topic.
But which you could have done without, I mean, you could have made that out of vacuum tubes. I mean, those switching
Oh,
circuits.
yes, everything was vacuum tubes, right. And relays.
Right. So did you end up doing electronics projects where you built some curious kind of device and things like that, or was it more, just courses that about things? I'm asking, did you build a great mousetrap when you were in college or something?
No. I had classmates who were into such a project. I wasn't attracted by that. I was attracted more into the theory, okay. Electromagnetic theories, the theory of electron microscope, things of that sort. The theory rather than the building of the devices.
I see. But so you were doing electromagnetic theory rather than so much kind of things like computing and switching theory and things like this.
Correct. Only the last year of college, we had class in Boolean algebra and synthesis of Boolean functions, and in semiconductors. Only the last class, because the transistor just came about and we heard about them. So some professors volunteered to teach the new stuff, and that was transistor.
But so most of the classes were kind of differential equations based kinds of mathematics,
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, complex analysis and wave theory and synthesis of circuits. That was a big emphasis on that.
And so
plus,
but okay, so then you finish college, then what?
Well, I finished college, I got married the last year of college. Also, my wife was a student at the same class, 120 male and 4 women, and I was the lucky one. And so we came here for the purpose of graduate studies, with the idea that we'll get our PhD or master's and go back in about a year or two and establish a family in Israel. That was the idea. It didn't materialize as we expected. We stayed here, we had children, and we remained here. I got my PhD only in 1965. I came here in 1960. So it took me 5 years. I had to work, and I was lucky to combine my work, my PhD research, with my work at RCA laboratories in Princeton, New Jersey. So I was lucky to combine my work with my dissertation research. And my wife too, she got a master's in Newark College of Engineering, which was an evening school.
But so at that time, RCA was a pretty, that was a famous research lab, was it not, at the time?
Correct, yes. It was looking back, it was fairly advanced. I don't know how RCA could afford that much of basic research. But you see, I ended up in a computer research group, which was hardware oriented. The mission was to find physical phenomena that could serve as memory devices. Okay. Because we understood that the core memories, magnetic core memories, are obsolete. Okay. They had to be strung by hand.
Yes.
They had to be strung by hand, and they were bulky, and they had all kind of problem. We understood that the future lies in different kind of memory device. So every phenomena that you can think of, photochromic effect, superconductivity, magnetic plated wires, every phenomena that had memory in it was potential to replace cores. So IBM and Fairchild Camera and the Bell Laboratories, we all rushed to look for phenomena that can replace core.
Isn't it funny how history ends up replaying itself? Because, you know, in quantum computing nowadays, it's the same story of people looking for all sorts of different physical phenomena that can, you know, store information and do computations.
Unbelievable.
So which was the what physical phenomenon were you kind of connected to in that?
I was connected with superconductivity. Yes, my dissertation is about superconductive memories using beautiful effect that you can store circulating current in one direction or another, and these eddy currents persist, and you can detect them with magnetic field, and you can read and write them in magnetic field, and you can move them around. If you pass current in superconductor, these vertices start moving perpendicular to the current that you send in. All kind of new phenomena were existing there. Some of them defy Faraday law. I was so excited. It was a combination of refuting Faraday with building a practical device that will beat core memories.
How big were the vortices?
Miniature. You can depends how thin the wire that you can print above a superconducting films. Okay. Tiny. But
So what happened to that technology? I mean, later on, people used Josephson junctions for some kinds of superconducting types of things. But
Josephson current was one of those phenomena that I couldn't sleep for a week because it's so easy to produce. You can't believe it. You put a wire, you put a solder drop over it, and you have a Josephson junction. You put it in a voltmeter, and you see quantum oscillation on a macroscopic level instead of Ohm's law. You know, I is equal to V over R. You have an oscillation. It doesn't go linear. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down. A whole week I was dreaming about it. Yeah, so that was, it's a phenomenon, beautiful. I think it's the only macroscopic quantum system. Oh, liquid helium is another one. Yeah.
Well, superconductivity itself is, you could argue that the phenomenon of superconductivity itself requires quantum mechanics.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can't explain it otherwise, except by the, what was the name?
Bose-Einstein condensation.
Cooper pair.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
But so were you actually doing the experiments with a lab bench type thing?
Yes, I did experiments. I proved that these vortices move. Okay, and I proved it by building a spiral which I rotated. It was a spiral like a Archimedes pump, and it moved those vertices and generated a DC current. So it was the first, DC generator which had no moving part. Anyhow,
so what happened to that technology? What happened to superconducting vortex technology?
Everything was wiped out by semiconductors.
I see.
It was, I don't know how they achieved it. We had a group in RCA also working on semiconductors, but we dismissed them and said they're never going to miniaturize it well enough, and no one is going to risk losing the memory when the power fails. Okay, the vulnerability to power failure was one of the major hindrance to their acceptance. They solved all the problems, the miniaturization and the power failure, and they turned me into a jobless scientist. Eventually.
A what?
Yes, a jobless scientist. Jobless.
Oh, jobless.
Yes.
How big were the transistors at the point where they were saying it was going to take over? I mean, had they been, there were, by that time, by 1965, there were early integrated circuits, weren't there?
Yes, but I'm talking about the 1963, 64, right? Yeah. But I remember we had a laboratory with the photoresists, miniaturization, and the technique was just starting there. Technique of printed circuits, of printed. Right. Just started, and they made it. It was a miracle. Well, I continued to work on magnetic devices 3 years after that, when I moved to California, in a company named Electronic Memories, trying to, instead of threading cords with a wire, to coat a wire with magnetic coat, and that way to replace core memories. But this too was wiped out. But I was at that time a laboratory man.
I'm just curious. What did your wife also do electromagnetic kinds of things, or was she different?
Yes. Well, she was hired by a company named Microwave Associates, I believe, and built antennas across the country to transmit information from east to west coast. So they had to design the antennas.
But so this point you're in California working on magnetic memories, and then what?
And then I was fired.
How come?
The company invested that many hundreds of thousands of dollars in my research. Okay, and here comes semiconductors and beats us and takes all the markets. No one bought any more magnetic memories. People bought semiconductor memories. Okay, I was then told, you better find yourself something else to do. And I had to, and then I went to, I called a family acquaintance of Jerry Estrin at the time, whom I knew by family relationship. And I told him, do you have any place in UCLA? And I said, what do you do? I told him what I do. He said, come over. Maybe we can find a slot for you. At that time, you see, industry looked down at universities because all the innovations that we speak about, the laser, the transistors, they were invented in the industry, not in the university. Okay?
Yep.
So for me, coming from industry to university was a great achievement for the university, right? So I was invited, come over, maybe we have a slot for you. Okay. I went over and I wanted to do software. I wanted to do software because I thought that software is exactly what intelligence is all about. Okay. So I wanted to do computer software. I first went to USC and I met the dean. I forgot his name now. And I told him I want to do software. I said, have you ever programmed before? I said, no. He said, they want to teach software? I said, yes. I said, what gives you the audacity? I said, I'm successful in everything I do. He threw me out of his office. Okay.
But so at this point, I mean, there were mainframe computers. Had you programmed in Fortran or assembly language or anything
Fortran,
like that?
Yes. I programmed in Fortran.
To do simulations of electromagnetic things?
Simulation of circuits.
Yeah,
But circuits, yeah.
So then, and that must have been a time when, I mean, was UCLA, I mean, it seems like the University of California kind of is always picking its new school to develop. I mean, it was Berkeley at the beginning, and then it sort of has moved around to different places. Was UCLA a fully developed kind of, or was it still a sort of frontier part of the University of California at that time?
I don't know, because I couldn't compare, and I didn't even know what university is.
Fair enough. So which department? So you said you wanted to do software. What department did they put a person who wanted to do software into?
They put me in a laboratory to do simulation of memory devices. Memory was still big, you know, and I taught a course on memory devices. And eventually I ended up in an engineering system department, which was a collection of interdisciplinary experts.
But so originally it had been electrical engineering or something, or did they even have a thing that was called computer? I'm sure they didn't have a thing called computer science yet.
It did. They did have. I think it was, yes, it was established maybe a year or two before I came. Yeah. Yes.
Was there a particular person who kind of, led the charge on computer science at UCLA, or?
Yes, Jerry Estrin.
Okay.
Yeah, he was one of the pioneers of computers. He actually he was the first to put the Golem system in Weizmann Institute in Rehovot, Israel. He brought his knowledge to Israel to establish the computer science department in the Weizmann Institute. And then he came back to UCLA. So he was a system person, computer system person, yeah.
So, okay, so now you're in this department, you're teaching a course on memories, and were you writing a lot of code at that time? And was this?
No. I was only writing a code that would simulate the physical behavior of computer memories or computer memory device. It was device oriented, yeah.
And so this was
and system, right? Go ahead.
So this was a kind of big deck of cards. You submit the deck of cards, somebody runs it on the mainframe and gives you the results back. Is that the
next day? Yes.
The next day, right?
The next day, yes.
Did they let you see if you were an electrical engineering professor? Did that allow you to be able to actually see the mainframe, or was the mainframe always behind many closed doors, so to speak?
It was behind closed doors, and I was not interested to see the mainframe. For some reason, I was not interested, yeah. And this was, by the way, it was a few weeks before Lenny Kleinrock sent the first message of the ARPANET, of the internet.
Yes, it was called ARPANET.
At that time, it was ARPANET, right? From UCLA to SRI, and started the intercomputer communication, which we call today internet.
So that must have been what, 1970 or something, or was
1969? It was in October of 1969.
Because I remember I worked at Caltech in the late 70s, early 80s, and there were these TIPS, terminal interface processors, which were how you got access to the ARPANET. And there was a UCLA TIP, I remember. So I think that was the later phase of that of the fact that the ARPANET was something that happened at UCLA, so to speak. There was also a USC TIP, as I recall.
I don't recall that because I wasn't interested. I didn't even know why are they celebrating and drinking champagne.
Oh, really? They were excited about it at that time. They knew it was a significant thing.
Yes. And they still have a museum with the same tip preserved at UCLA, and one office below me.
Okay. So then what? How did did you were teaching classes? Did you have like students and things at that time, or were you?
Yes. Sort of. I should say that my love was not in memory, although my experience was in memory, but my life was in human intelligence. Because even in RCA, when we were there doing superconductivity, we all understood that the future lies in computers, and that eventually, with no hesitation, computers is going to do everything that human can do today. It was only a matter of when and how. Okay? But already there in RCA, meddling with the core memories and with magnetic memories, everybody was thinking about perception, associative memories, not causal reasoning, but doing cognitive tasks that we knew eventually will be done by computers.
But so
that
at that time, I mean, people were doing the beginnings of things like, had done optical character recognition and things like that. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Yes.
And so I
Yes.
don't remember it immediately, but RCA never really got into the computer business. But what was their, were they close to being in the computer business, or were they?
Yes, they had a whole computer department.
Oh, okay.
Headed by John Reichman, who was one of the inventors of the magnetic core.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So he was heading a big department with 5 different groups. Saul Amarel was one of them. He did artificial intelligence, actually, at that time. He was concerned about playing games, solving the missionary and cannibal problem on a computer. Yeah, the idea was there and the vision was there that eventually artificial intelligence is going to take over.
So I'm curious, the lineage of that. I mean, so this was, we're talking there 1960s.
1960s.
Right. So, I mean, things like, there was a famous 1956 conference about, theories of automata and so on. That was the kind of, Shannon Minsky,
I didn't know about it.
Crowd. That was a separate branch.
Yes, separate branch. Yeah.
So where had the branch, I mean, were like McCulloch-Pitts neural nets, were they a thing people talked about at RCA, or was that again yet a different branch?
It was a rumor. It wasn't
okay.
Not the
those
big
things that they come into existence in the 1940s. They were not new.
I know. Yeah.
But so when they thought about computers, what did they mean by? Were they thinking about sort of the what an IBM mainframe does? Or were they thinking about theoretical computer science, or what was the when they were talking about computers and artificial intelligence? What was their kind of underlying model for what was going on?
I think at that time already we had the separation between the hardware and the functional level of thinking. We talked in terms of functional level. How do you construct associative memory?
Okay.
How you embed it was immaterial. In what kind of physical device you embed it was immaterial. People talk about various, even magnetic memory that will have associative properties to them. But that was immaterial. The functional problem was more important. So,
so what was the model of computation? Was it Turing machines? Was it like register machine type things, or was it
Fortran?
Okay, that's what I was guessing. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so it was things like, and so when people were talking about data structures, Fortran is not very friendly to data structures.
Right.
I mean, and associative memories are creatures that kind of seem to need data structures. So what were people thinking about in those?
People thinking about making a memory where the association will be created at the memory level itself.
I see. In hardware.
In hardware,
and then,
yes.
And then there would be some kind of Fortran-like thing that would be the interface to that.
Yes, correct.
But so when people were talking about artificial intelligence, you're talking about game playing and things like that. That must have been, we'll program the game in Fortran? Was that kind of the idea, or was it a different kind of approach?
I tell you, when I got into games, and that was later, it was in 1970s, programming was a side issue. I did all my work on heuristics without programming a game. That's mathematics. So I stopped programming already at that point, before I came into analysis of games.
That's shocking for somebody like me, at least. I program every day.
I know. So we are in different culture.
It's fair enough. But then you were getting into more the mathematics of. But I'm still curious. The people who are talking about artificial intelligence, the kind of the sort of conceptual framework that they were using, was it theory of computation? Was it kind of we can invent a heuristic? Or
not for me. For me, it was step by step. I went through image encoding, for instance, to condense to transmit and to represent images with less with the minimum number of bits. Okay, I call it image encoding. I spent about 3 years on that, trying to do there's a transformation, Kahunen-Loewe transform and Walsh transform on the images, so we'll be able to transmit them with less bits.
So I mean, like with a Walsh transform, it's kind of a discrete analog of a Fourier transform. So you were like, get rid of the high frequency pieces of the image type thing, kind of like GIF and like JPEG, I suppose, today.
That's what it was, absolutely, yeah.
Any
orthonormal transform was a candidate at that time.
But so did that turn, when you were doing that kind of work, did that turn into papers or did that turn into?
Oh yes, it turned into papers, heavy papers, in the IEEE transaction on image processing.
And was that part of the kind of lineage that led to things like, I mean, to TIFF and GIF and things like that, or were there different branches?
And now you're talking about new generation that I wasn't part of. I don't know about TIFF and GIF, although TIFF generates some association in my mind. I'm not sure.
I think it's, I mean, they use Fourier transforms, I think, rather than Walsh transforms, but it's the same idea, I believe. And later on, they're using things like these dictionary compression methods, the LZW and things like that, which are a slightly different idea. That they're not like, not like function transforms. But so what led you to so okay, so this was the 1970s we're talking about here.
In the 1970s, yes. And then I taught classes in decision theory, and that brought me into statistics, into sequential analysis, and reading all the materials that was connected with decision theory from Savage, from Reifa, and what was it, Reifa? I forgot the second author.
So this was, I mean, that was stuff that came out of kind of the operations research, linear programming tradition. Is that right?
Yes, yes. Operational research, it was also part of statistics at that time. And since I had a class in decision theory, I had to read all this stuff. And then got me also into philosophy of science. I read Reichenbach, I was fascinated. Okay, I read Popper, and I read even Savage, the foundation of statistics. Beautiful stuff, and get me thinking philosophically about what probability is, what statistics is, what decision is. Yeah.
What I mean, a kind of a math thing. I'm not sure I understand. I mean, in traditional operations research and linear programming and so on, that's not a statistical story. That's here we've got a bunch of constraints, find the optimal condition. But it was combined with statistics as a matter of kind of university structure, or it was combined with statistics because there was some kind of intellectual interplay between those. I mean, I think operations research.
No, it wasn't part of operation research. I forgot who forced me to teach a class in decision theory. I forgot which department and which chairman forced me, but I'm thankful for him or her because it got me into this area. Okay. I remember I used the book by Ferguson, who is a statistician, and he talks about the Bayes versus minimax and all kind of strategies, sequential analysis, and it got me thinking philosophically about the things which I only wanted to think about, and I couldn't have the tools and the language. So through decision theory, I got into thinking about the nature of uncertainty and decision.
So what were the applications? I mean, were there particular applications of decision theory that you were?
None.
Theory.
None. It was just teaching decision theory for the sake of teaching children how you, students, how you take information and you convert it into optimal action.
And was that, I mean, in the kind of thing you were doing, was there a bunch of sort of the game theory stuff that impinged on that, or was it separate from that?
It was separate. Well, game theory was part of the decision theory course, yes. But I got into games from a different angle. That was in the end of 1970s, yeah. I got into artificial intelligence, and the main problem was playing chess. That was the main focus of activity at the end of 1970s. We wanted to beat people in chess. Chess was the litmus test for intelligence.
Right.
So everybody and his brother was working on games, alpha beta procedures. Can you beat alpha beta? Minimize the number of steps, maximize the number of look ahead. Okay, learning the evaluation functions. All these were in the era, and I got into that before I published my first book on heuristics. Okay, from this angle, because I love the idea that you have here a crucible or a laboratory to test the handshaking between intuition and reasoning. On the one hand, you had intuition about how good a game position is. That had to be stored explicitly. And then you had the search, the look ahead, and the minimax, the rollback. Okay. It was also, by the way, Shannon invention, the minimax, rollback. Okay. In 1948, by the way. Okay. So that fascinated me, that you have this trade-off between spending time on building a better evaluation function versus spending time searching ahead, and what the trade-off between the two. So I spent all my time on game, and I think I proved some nice theorem. At least it satisfied me. What
kind of thing, when you were doing evaluation functions for game configurations, what kinds of things got thrown into those evaluation functions? I mean, what kind of a, was it in the end a big lump of Fortran code, or was it something which was more kind of principled?
I don't know about the underlying code. I know about what it meant. It was simple linear regression.
Okay. So today that would be kind of what one would talk about as, features found by some machine learning system was kind of you were looking for sort of features that would be the indicators of game state, so to speak. Is that a fair characterization, or?
Yeah, correct. No, I think we were given the features and we had to weigh them, how important they are in combining to give you an overall evaluation of a board position.
Right.
It was just a linear comment. It was Samuel work in early 1960s, I believe, right? And it was the first.
Right, that was the
Checker,
famous.
Yes, checker, correct. Yeah. My basic work was about the look ahead, about the search and rolling back, and what can you say about the optimality of the algorithm, of the search algorithm? How can you prune nodes that you haven't seen by some criterion?
Right.
So I proved that alpha beta is optimal, for instance.
Okay.
So that was one of my.
those multi-way systems that I was talking about, which you can implement for games, a bunch of these questions about, this whole question about, when you do, I don't know, theorem proving or logic programming and so on, you're always trying to find the path that is the best one through that whole collection. And there's, this story of pruning seems to be a consistent theme that these days people, it's like if you're doing automated theorem proving, it's how do you find which path you want to go down and how do you ignore the other ones? And a still somewhat unsolved problem. But
you do it with heuristics, and then the question, can the program generate heuristic on its own automatically?
Right.
And the idea was, yes, you can do it by with the following scheme. Heuristic gives you it's the optimal solution to a simplified problem.
Okay.
So instead of dealing with a complex problem, simplify it to a point where you can find the optimal solution.
Mm-hmm.
The optimal solution to a simplified problem is heuristic for the original problem, for the complex problem. Okay, and that could be automated if you knew what you mean by simplification, and if you knew what you mean by we need two elements there. I forgot the second element. So simplification was by relaxation.
But so, for example, you have a chessboard and you say, I don't care about the particular positions of the pawns. I only care about how many pawns are there. And then you say, and then you're operating within that space where you describe the board only with a small subset of its degrees of freedom.
And that's a little bit crude. No one will buy that for chess. But let's look at a simple thing like finding the optimal path in a maze. Okay? The heuristic there will be find the shortest path without any obstacles. Okay? Not in a maze, but with an empty space. Okay?
Right.
That is known to be a straight line. So the length of the optimal path in an unobstructed game will be heuristic for the shortest path in the maze.
So, one thing I'm curious about is when that kind of, generally these kind of find the optimal thing on a landscape that is comparatively smooth, it is easier than on a landscape that is incredibly rugged. And I'm curious when, the approach of, in a sense, when you say find a simplified problem, if I were to think about that in terms of optimization on a landscape, it would be, let me put, some covering over this landscape. Let me find convex hulls of the mountains or something, and then solve the problem on the convex hulls of the mountains. And then, and then that will give me an indication of what to do. But I'm
absolutely
curious.
That will give you which steps to explore next.
Right.
In the original problem.
Right.
It doesn't give you the solution, but it only guides you into what to explore next.
But I would assume that it depends on the structure of the problem, whether there are approximations that are, leading you in the right direction, or whether in the end, the final solution is this tiny little hole in the mountains that you'd never find by doing any of these kinds of approximate approaches.
Well, eventually you find it, because you always do the reasoning in addition to the evaluation. So you do look ahead, and you do back, and you do backtrack, and you do it again. Right. So eventually you find it. The question is how much effort you're going to spend before you find it.
Right.
But it's a proof that, for instance, there is admissible heuristic, a notion of admissible heuristic, which is built on relaxation of the original problem. And that can be proven to be admissible in the sense that you eventually will find the global optimum.
But so, for example, if you're doing something like finding a path through a graph, it must depend on how wild the graph is. In other words, if there is a particular shortest path, you could say, well, let me fuzz out the graph and look only at some kind of approximate thing where I'm just looking at pieces of the graph where I've aggregated parts together. you know, there must be conditions on the graph such that it's possible to, that certain kinds of aggregation will be good guides to finding the final result. I mean,
I wasn't that sophisticated. I was just concerned about the admissibility, whether you have a guarantee that eventually you'll find the optimal one. And that was proven. And then the mechanization of the discovery, of the heuristic discovery. What do you relax? What kind of obstacle you relax in the original graph in order to get a simplified graph to get a good heuristic? Yeah. So that is, by the way, it's still being automated today and being used in the planning community, in automatic planning.
For what? I mean, I'm curious because, well, there's a thing that I happen to be studying about graphs and about kind of the way that you scan through graphs, because it's deeply related to the way that one thinks about space-time and so on. But this is going to get us way off track if we start talking about this is in the world of causal graphs with 10 to the 500 nodes. That's that story. But okay. So I'm curious, and we're kind of going a bit long on time here. But I predicted that it would take longer than we expected to go through all these interesting things. But so
you remind me of prehistory. Historical time.
Right. So so at what point, when did you discover causality as being the thing that you were excited about? Was that
indirectly? I started with the probability. So expert system came along in the end of 1970s, and the people were concerned about how to encode knowledge that comes from experts. Now,
I remember. Yes, I remember all this stuff. Right, I was
remember?
around.
Oh, good. Yeah, good. So we have systems like Myson and others.
What was your favorite knowledge representation?
Okay, so I did not go into the construction of a system itself. The issue was how to represent uncertainty. Yeah. You had rules. The initial idea was to do it by rules and to quantify the rules with the degree of uncertainty, and then to combine the rules.
I see.
Yeah, so you have a rule like saying if you have malaria, then you if you have fever, then you have then you have malaria with a certain certainty. And if you have malaria, then you had a trip to Africa with a certain certainty. Okay? And you had to combine those rules, and the way they combined them with the ad hoc, this rule combination did not obey the rule of probabilities. They could not exhibit certain properties that we would like to see in handling uncertainty. For instance, you don't want, for instance, I'll give you a simple example. If you have smoke, then you must have had fire someplace with certain certainty. And if you have fire, then you have smoke in certain certainty, okay? Now you have a feedback loop. So you start running and you suddenly discover that you have to sound the alarm because there must be a certainty of 1 for fire out of nowhere, just out of the feedback. Okay? So here you have an example of where if you are not careful about the sources of knowledge, then you have this running positive feedback effect.
So just to understand, I mean, the early systems like Myson and Dendral and all these kinds of things, these were pure deterministic kind of term rewriting rule-based systems. Is that right? Or did they have probabilities in the beginning?
They started with the deterministic rules, and then they had to build in uncertainty. because every rule has exceptions. Every rule
I
has
see.
certain abnormalities.
But so it was still discrete probability. It was like this rule will fire with this probability and this other rule will fire with some other probability. Is that right?
Correct, correct. Yeah, it's not only a probability of firing, the probability of the end results.
I see. So did they also then have probability distributions? Like if this happens, there's some Gaussian distribution of the result.
Oh, no Gaussian. No, it was just the certainty factors. They call them certainty factors. Each rule was decorated with a certainty factor.
Okay.
And when you have a bunch of rules standing there asking for priority or asking for conclusion, you have to combine all the rules with their certainty factors with a certain calculus. And there was no calculus, there was only ad hoc procedure for combining them. And this ad hoc procedure violated some basic desiderata that we want from that sort. For instance, if you recall our diagram with
earthquakes and things.
Cause?
Yeah.
Either it was an earthquake or what was the other cause?
Burglar alarm.
A burglar alarm. Good. Okay. So you and I understand that if you have more evidence that that the earthquake took place, then the probability that it was the burglar alarm goes down. Okay? That's called explain-away effect.
Okay.
You have evidence for one of the cause, it takes away credibility from the other cause. That's called explain-away. We communicate like that, and we expect to see that in an expert system. It didn't happen because the rule always combine monotonically. You never have this taking down evidence. Okay? And so it defies that. Plus a combination of causal and diagnostic rule did not match up. For instance, if the grass is wet, then it rained. If I turn the sprinkler on, the grass is going to be wet. Therefore, change the rules. If I turn the sprinkler on, it rained. It's just rule chaining, okay? With uncertainty. If you want uncertainty, fine. Okay? But it's a secondary. If you chain two rules, one of them is diagnostic, one of them is causal, you get unreasonable or paradoxical result. You don't want to conclude that it rained from the fact that you turn the sprinkler on.
Right.
That was kind of a paradoxical result that made everybody mad. Something is wrong with our management of uncertainty. Okay? But I knew that Bayes' theorem doesn't enter into that kind of paradoxical. I knew it from teaching decision theory. Okay? So I said, let's do it by Bayesian, so we wouldn't get into this kind of paradoxical situation. But unfortunately, do it with Bayes' probability, with Bayesian conditioning, had the problem of complexity. Because as we saw before, if you had a 2 to the n table to express the probability distribution, then you have a problem of exponential time and exponential space to do things by orthodox probability. Okay? So you couldn't afford to go back to the table and encode your knowledge in probabilities, in standard probabilities. So everybody had the idea that probability days are over because of the complexity involved. So it was an agreement in the AI community that probabilities are not fit to handle human kind of uncertainty.
So this was, I mean, you know, in the early 80s, everybody was saying expert systems, you know, they were interviewing experts about oil exploration or about medicine or whatever else. And they were going to encode all this data in the expert systems, and then everything was going to be great. This did not pan out. I mean, that general approach did not pan out. I'm not completely sure in retrospect why. It seemed, I mean, aspects of it, at least that I saw, seemed kind of naive in terms of what kinds of, how you would represent the kinds of knowledge that people had. A very, I mean, in a sense, it was very kind of logic based of if this happens, then this will happen and so on. And that seemed like it wasn't necessarily the right kind of model. But I'm curious what your impression of why did expert systems not take over the world?
I think is because they try to model the expert rather than the environment. They try to model the doctor instead of the disease. See?
I see.
So, and the doctor wasn't able to articulate the various procedure he or she goes through when doing diagnosis, especially when it had to when it comes to combining different sources of knowledge.
So basically, what you're saying is, I mean, the sort of that approach to AI was too AI oriented, as in it was trying to model brains too much, and it should have been trying to model the actual systems that were being studied by the brains, so to speak.
The disease, the environment.
Yes.
Not the brain of the physician, but the disease, as we know that. And the thing that made it really convincing that we should go the second route was reconfigurability, which means if you got the knowledge already and one component change, let's say you do diagnosis on a car engine, and you have a different model of the car, okay? The pump is situated in different place. You don't want to redo the entire engine. You want to just redo the things which depends on the new location of the pump. Okay? So it was the issue of reconfigurability. So you can reconfigure the new knowledge system on the basis of the previous one, just change locally one component, modularity. It was a real issue, and that was the decisive. In the user domain, it was a decisive reason to change over from a rule-based system into a Bayesian network.
But I mean, in the rules and the deterministic rules, they will not have had a problem with modularity, because the deterministic rules will have had essentially submodules and if it gets to this configuration, then you have to deal with these rules and so on. Presumably that came about because they tried to add probabilities, and that kind of
it wasn't their choice. It wasn't a luxury that they were after. Every rule has exceptions. Okay.
Well, yes, I mean, I have to say, in my own efforts and things, I always consider probability to be kind of an admission of a certain amount of defeat. That is, if in a situation, to say that there's probability of something is to say there's something you don't know about the system.
Correct.
Something exogenous to what you're dealing with. And, in the surprise, I mean, in my own sort of efforts of studying things, is that there are a lot of places where people see kind of random behavior and they say that must just be accounted for by probability. There's something we don't know going on. But actually, there's an intrinsic source of randomness within the system itself that is perfectly, I mean, like classic example being the digits of pi. The digits of pi are very, they pass all standard tests of randomness. Yet there's a perfectly good algorithm for generating those digits. And it isn't the case that the digits of pi are random because it's just a probability to have the next digit, so to speak. So it's kind of I think I have to say in some of my own efforts, I've been I have not been a big enthusiast of probabilities. As far as I'm concerned, are you didn't really nail the model. You have something that you're saying I don't know about a piece of it. Now, obviously, there are many practical situations in which probability is the right model, but for example, in our model of fundamental physics now, and this is how we end up with these 10 to the 500 node causal graphs and things, it is a completely deterministic model. and it's a model where there is no, you're not saying there's anything there are no miracles in the universe, so to speak. And it's like there's just a deterministic rule. It's being run, and it happens to have many branches that correspond to different things in quantum mechanics and so on. But in the end, it's a fully deterministic story. So for me, at least, whenever you talk about probabilities, it's like, well, there's a piece of the system you don't know about, and if only you knew more, you could get rid of the probabilities. But I think that I understand that probability is I mean, you say people have to have probabilities. I'm slightly disputing that for some cases where people have added probabilities to things. But I understand that as a practical matter, it's a good way of parameterizing what happens in the world. But anyway, we digress. No, I mean, so we should. So I guess we almost reached your kind of modern thinking about causality, I think. Did we reach your modern thinking, or are there more steps here?
Once we go over the Bayesian network, which had causality in the back of the mind of people who constructed it when they didn't know that, and they officially they define things in terms of conditional independencies, which are purely probabilistic notion, and causality was not part of the discussion, but it sat there in the mind of the people who used it, and it accounted for all the good things that Bayesian network could deliver, such reconfigurability. And then came causality, then in the back door, I should say.
But so. Right, but so I mean, one of the big points being that rather than everything can affect everything, you have this actual sort of flow of cause and effect that allows only, that you're dealing with DAGs rather than just a single blob of giant probability table. I mean, and
that was a Bayesian network. I dealing with DAGs instead of a giant blob of probability table. Beautifully put.
Right. So then what?
It's based on an input. The input based on certain assumptions. The judgmental assumptions are the existence of the conditional independencies among certain nodes.
Why can't you discover that? I mean, if you see enough data, why can't you discover those causal connections?
That has to do with learning Bayesian network. Yeah, you can discover them. Although, okay, go ahead. That's fine. You can discover them, and you can find, because you have latent variables that you don't see. That's why you can discover them. But fine, if you have no latent variables, you can discover them, and you can find the structure of the Bayesian network. Absolutely. Not the directionality, because the directionality is still arbitrary.
Right.
Because you can run a chain one way or the other, and you still have the same compatibility with the data.
Right. I hadn't realized that the Bayesian network tradition had come out of the expert systems world. I'm curious, at the time of expert systems, neural nets were very much in retreat. I mean, neural nets were, they'd had their day in the 1940s, 1950s. They were, there was starting to be thinking about, there were 1980-ish, I remember there were, things like the Hopfield network, and there were various other kinds of things like this, but they seemed like a separate branch. They weren't being taken seriously in the kind of AI type world at that time. Had they, I mean, it seemed like expert systems, which were, I mean, from what I saw of them, they were much more an engineering solution. They were not, it sounds like the things you were doing with them were principled kind of mathematical approaches. A lot of what was done with them was very much, I had the impression at least, was kind of an engineering, not even software engineering, kind of sort of let's hack these pieces together to see if we can get some result that's useful. Is that a fair characterization, or is that
of what? Of neural nets?
No, of the expert systems business.
Yes,
that was
expert system, right? It was a hacking kind of culture. We had there was a tension between the needy and the scruffy. The scruffies were the let's get things done and worry about guaranteed later. And the needy wanted to guarantee that what you're doing has some coherence, has some properties that you would like to expect in what you're building. So, but the scruffies were dominated the field. Because they had,
most of that was in industrial research, right? Or were there a lot of university? I mean, my impression, my recollection is there were a lot of kind of big companies and government organizations and things like that that were talking about we're going to turn everything into expert systems. But at the time, I wouldn't even have known in which department at a university to find expert systems experts, so to speak.
I think, no idea. I don't know if it was only computer science, if they were on top of the expert hierarchy, or whether it penetrated to the oil exploration departments. I don't know.
I would think, I mean, I have to say, if I were to guess, I would guess that like business school type places would have had people doing, decision theory, that kind of area might have been a place where you would find those things. I'm not sure. But so did the work that you do, did it end up getting into kind of large scale applications at that time, or was it more
the Bayesian network got into large scale applications?
Certainly later, I'm aware of that.
Later. Yeah.
But at the time of expert systems, did it somehow make it into the expert systems world or not? I think that world had kind of by 1990 that was definitely in retreat. That whole initiative, at least that was my impression of expert systems.
In Bayesian network came into being only in the 1980.
Right.
In 1985, I did my first paper, but I was triggered by a paper from the neural net. Thinking, because I spent some time in San Diego visiting Rumelhart.
Okay.
Who was a neural net guy, and he did work on reading comprehension, how children read text. And he had a model where you have a hierarchy of processors, each one grammatical processor, a word processor, a feature, and word and letter, and they were communicating with each other back and forth, shaking hands, each one providing evidence for or against certain option of the neighbor. Okay? And he postulated this to be a distributed message passing system that's the only way to explain how children read and comprehend text so quickly and so reliably. So he proposed this message passing scheme from reading comprehension, which I thought is terrific. If we can only do it with probability, then we get two birds in one shot: the computational advantage of message passing and the coherence that probability provides you with. So
No, that's it. I mean, because that, I think, at that time there was the whole PDP, parallel distributed processing thing being talked about neural nets. But it seemed like Rumelhart's approach came from a much higher level. It was kind of like there were the low level, let's just wire up very simple neurons, and there was more the kind of psychology oriented, let's start from these large scale modules about things that we think brains can do, so to speak. And it's I mean, the modern sort of enthusiasm about deep learning and so on has come out of, I think, the let's start from very simple neurons and build up from that, rather than the more psychological, let's have these bigger modules and build down from those, so to speak. But so it's interesting. I mean, it makes sense that, because in your kind of networks, every node has a name, so to speak, is my impression. I mean, you can, there is a variable and you know what that variable means, so to speak.
Correct,
which is
yes.
very different from the kind of, let's make a giant neural net with, with 100 million, weights in it, and we don't know what any of those.
Correct. So, but he came from the second route, namely from a psychological viewpoint. We have a puzzle here, how children read so fast. And we have names for, or at least partially we have a name for the different level of analysis. We know that it is a grammatical constraint there. And there are word and features, optical features, right? We know that they exist somewhere. So how do they shake hands? That is a question. He proposed a message passing scheme.
So did that, is there a Bayesian network that is in fact a good model at this point of how kids read?
No, I didn't go there, but the message passing idea triggered my work on the Bayesian network. And that was the element that made Bayesian network acceptable. Because if you can run this message passing scheme, you don't have to program anything. You just program how one neighbor communicates with its neighbor, one node communicates with its neighbors, and you're done. The rest is done asynchronously. It's done by message passing. And
wait a minute. So you've got to write down the architecture basically for what, which level communicates with what level, and the neighboring, the things separated.
You have to write down the structure of the knowledge base. Yes, like we had there with the alarm system. You have to write that down. But then all you need to specify is the functions. How does the node named alarm affected by the family, by the parents? Okay?
Right.
And you do it for every segment, for every family in the network. You finished. Now you ask a question. I observed node 17. What's the probability of node number 23 to be true? Okay. Right. The rest, you don't have to program it. You're finished.
But so there are two different things here. I mean, one is given a certain set of sort of probability functions for the nodes, you can then make deductions in all sorts of directions. You can say if this thing fires, then what's the probability that you can kind of walk around the whole thing. That seems like that's kind of once you have the network, you can compute probabilities for different things and so on.
Yeah.
I guess there's a different thing which is learning from once you see data, then updating the probability functions within the network. That's a different thing.
It's a different task. Yes. That's because learning Bayesian network as opposed to using it.
Right.
Or doing it or using it for inference.
Right. Well, this is, I mean, in the sort of the language of modern neural nets, people are always talking about the kind of execution or inference type phase versus the training phase, and those are two different and take very different amounts of effort to achieve, so to speak.
Yeah, correct.
But so I mean, the idea of neural net training became a thing sort of somewhat, I mean, there had been a very early version of it, but the more serious kind of backpropagation-ish approaches and automatic differentiation kinds of approaches, was that a separate branch of work from the kinds of things that you were doing with Bayesian networks?
Yes,
or was that
totally unrelated?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't watch the development of this neural network architecture and training that you are talking about. That took place without my knowledge. I was surprised that they can do so well in so many.
Everybody was in 2011 or something. Everybody was surprised, I think.
Correct.
But so the algorithms, when you're training your Bayesian networks, presumably, is that you know, you can, if you have discrete probabilities, you can presumably do the training. And what kinds of functions, what kinds of distributions can you have at each node? And I mean, maybe you can do the training in some Monte Carlo kind of way, or how do you do the training? Is it difficult, and does it end up being like the backpropagation kind of algorithm to do training when you have an arbitrary, you know, you're being shown data and you've got certain distribution, certain probability distributions that you can have at the node?
I worked only on discrete cases, so I cannot tell you in general. And I use and or, noisy or and noisy and gates.
Okay.
So you have only disjunction and conjunction as you run through the tree. That's all you have.
Did you, I mean, I'm curious, just in terms of the connection of different ideas, I mean, did the fuzzy logic business, is that at all related to the kinds of things you've thought about, or is that kind of yet its own separate branch?
Fuzzy logic was a competitor in the time where we were looking for a calculus for uncertainty. So Lotfi Zadi proposed his fuzzy logic as an alternative to probability theory. Theoretically, if you assign every proposition a degree of uncertainty, or every variable essentially, a degree of uncertainty, which he didn't call uncertainty, he called fuzziness, okay? And that will solve the problem. But it didn't, because it was completely divorced from the issue of combining uncertainty of different segments of the network. It could not solve that problem of combination. It did not exhibit explaining away. It could not combine diagnosis versus causal rules. So it was totally orthogonal to the issue of combining uncertainties. There was another competitor, which was belief functions, Dempster-Schaeffer calculus. That was a totally different one. We now understand where it stands, but it also had the difficulties in meeting those desiderata. So it was totally orthogonal to the fight. Eventually, probabilities took over. People believe that probability is the way to organize knowledge. So, and that took place. Yeah.
What I mean, this and the kind of the graphical models kind of, I mean, that's another term I've heard used for that's the same thing as you're talking about, yes? Or is that's
graphical models? Yes, graphical models are based on input in the form of conditional independencies.
I see.
And Markov random field, for instance. All these are based on input in the form of conditional independencies.
You said Markov random fields. I mean, in kind of things I know about, those tend to be you know, very large numbers of more or less identical degrees of freedom, rather than the kinds of things you seem to be talking about, where it's more like there are named variables and so on. Is that a different? I mean, yeah.
Markov random fields are undirected Bayesian network. They don't have directionality of the arrows.
Okay.
So you encode the uncertain. You encode the conditional independency in a form of undirected graph. The missing connection is no longer an arrow. The missing link there conveys the idea that neighbors which are not connected are conditional independent, giving anything which intersects their path between them.
I see.
Okay, very simple, undirected graph.
Right.
If you want to know if two nodes are independent giving some other set, just ask yourself whether the other set intersect all paths going from A to B. Very simple specification.
So,
Bayesian network is different. Yeah, go ahead.
If we now get to kind of the present day and the sort of the life of causal networks and probabilistic causal networks and so on, what have been your favorite applications of these kinds of things, or do you not know? I mean, I know, in my life I build tools and I sometimes invent theories and things, and one often has no idea how the things actually get used.
I don't know. People tell me that in every iPhone you have an error correcting scheme, which is essentially a Bayesian network. Okay?
For doing what?
Error correcting.
Of what? Of like your typing, or of the
Of the signal coming in.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But so, in terms of the error correcting code for transmission of the data,
not the code itself, but the deciphering of the code. Okay, you want to decipher the. You have redundancy anyhow, but you want to do it. You want to find the character that is most likely the one that was sent.
Mm-hmm.
And you do it by passing messages between neighboring characters, and exactly how they do it, I'm not sure.
Is this the turbo code business, or is that some other?
Which code? Which code?
The turbo codes?
Yeah, absolutely. The turbo code is a version of the Bayesian network belief propagation scheme. There is a paper by somebody, McKay, I believe, in Caltech, saying turbo code is a special case of Pearl belief propagation. Yeah.
Interesting. So that's the decoder. That's the way the decoder works for that.
Correct. Yes.
That's cool. So I mean, are there other
people tell me that Siri has a Bayesian network, but I cannot verify that. It's just rumors.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I probably could tell you more about that actually, because when the original company, Siri was kind of originally developed at SRI, and it uses our Wolfram Alpha system as its way of doing question answering. But the front end for that was something like a Bayesian network, I think, that was trying to guess various aspects of what was being said. I'm not sure that was the part that I would consider worked the best.
Great.
But, I think it is a matter of implementation, because that's the example, in the natural language understanding that we do. I think that the classic question was, this was actually Steve Wozniak asked Siri when Siri was first out, what's the 10th prime number? Okay, and our sort of Wolfram Alpha system underneath can answer that perfectly well. You say, what's the 10th prime number? And it'll happily tell you whatever the 10th prime number is. I don't know what it is, but it'll compute it. But Siri, for a while at least, used to tell you the location of the nearest prime rib restaurant.
Oh,
and this was I'm afraid that would have to be probably attributed to some overly probabilistic way of analyzing the input, input data, because it's kind of but yeah. So I'm that's an interesting case. I mean that's a sort of an interesting comparison, I suppose, between probabilistic. I mean the way that, for example, we do natural language understanding is not very probabilistic. I guess it has certain aspects of it. It does have scoring of various kinds, but and it's a good question actually. If we were to think about what's inside our natural language understanding system, whether one could think of that as propagation of probabilities and so on, I actually don't know. So but
I don't know either, because I really lose interest in the application. Once I send it and I publish the paper, I'm going after the next task, the next puzzle, I should say, and I lose interest in how people use my old results. It just doesn't interest me, except when I'm being interviewed, and then people ask me, "How is it being used?" I say, I don't know.
Right. Yes. Well, it's always that people don't necessarily, when your thing is used, they don't necessarily send you an email saying, guess what? This really cool piece of technology that you've heard about uses your idea. people very rarely send that piece of email. Sometimes you find that out when you run into them somewhere, but that piece of email is a very rare one to be seen.
Yes.
But so do you have have you maintained, I mean, as you've worked on different problems, have you kind of always maintained the sort of the list of the next problems you want to work on? Or do these problems kind of, is it like, well, I've planned to work on this thing X years from now, and then you finally get around to it? Or is it more like this particular opportunity showed up at this moment and that's what you did next?
I think it's the latter, yes. Opportunities come up and I say, gee, with this in hand, we can do that and that and that.
Okay, so what's the low-hanging fruit that you're currently seeing in the orchard, so to speak, of things that
right now, an automated scientist, that's number one. We can do it. Personalized medicine, we have the tools to do it. And third will be social intelligence. We can do it.
I don't know what that one means. What does that one mean?
Personalized medicine?
No, the social intelligence.
Social intelligence is a knowledge system that can answer questions which have human relationships in its vocabulary. Ideas such as trust, reliable, such as like, compassion, it's good for you, believe me, all these are relationships that we grew up with. We are more familiar with those relationships than we are with diseases, okay? And we grew up with them. We are very tuned to whether a mother smiles or frowns. So it's very important for us. And we probably encode it in some way, and we communicate that way. That's how societies are developed and culture developed. And we neglected it, I'm saying the AI community or the computer science development community, have neglected it. Right? Now we have the tools to tackle it. Why do I say that? Because we have now the tools of deep understanding. We are sitting on a gold mine. It's the first computer model of a system that it exhibit deep understanding of a certain domain. And my definition, my formalization is every system that answers question on 3 levels of the ladder of causation, it exhibits deep understanding. What does it mean? It means it understands associations, understand interventions, and understand counterfactual. Undoing.
So when you talk about social intelligence, so that system would be something where you should be able to ask, a question about human behavior, so to speak. If you've got your network set up correctly, you should be able to say, is this person going to decide to buy my product or something? Or is this person going to, or is this person going to be friends with such and such a person?
Friend is a part of social intelligence, yes. Is this friend going to trust me in the future now that I've given you the wrong result, the wrong advice? Okay, are you aware of the fact that I haven't eaten for the past 3 days? Are you aware? Okay, which means you have 2 kinds of knowledge. You have a knowledge that you have access to, and you have a knowledge which is stored explicitly. Okay, that you are familiar with, it is in your working memory. All these are relationships which are a part of our social conversation. And these must be should be encoded. And the reason I'm saying that we have the tools is because we have a deep understanding as far as an agent and the environment. Using that, we can augment it with agent and another agent.
So it kind of reminds me of virtual worlds like The Sims or something. The Sims is this virtual world where there are sort of human-like characters who interact with each other and so on. And they have, I think actually their kind of algorithmic basis is a simplified version of the kind of thing you're talking about. I'm not sure that there's a chap who worked in my company for a while who'd been.
I'm not
who'd been in
familiar with
charge of,
SIMS, although it rings the bell. Who wrote SIMS?
it was Electronic Arts, but it was Will Wright was the original person who was the game designer. I admit that I'm not a video games person. I'm only a watcher of these things. But there's a chap who worked at a company for a while who had been in charge of the production of that game, and I would always give him a hard time for the fact that I think he acted in real life much like the Sims in the game would act in terms of, given these inputs, this is what you'll do type thing. Because
hopefully I think this system is going to be more sophisticated and not rule-based, but will really emulate the relationship among people.
Right. Yeah, I think so actually coming back to your automated scientist thing. So what I assume you mean there is, here's a bunch of data, go find sort of relationships in this data.
No. You are talking about level 0, that association, find relationship. What do you mean relationship?
You're talking about, if I ask a question about that data, what if this happened? What would have happened if this had this had been done?
A scientist doesn't deal with a real scientist. Think about what is the next experiment that I should do in order to distinguish between these two competing hypotheses. Okay? So he first has hypotheses, and then he has a query about whether I should treat a patient this way or that way, and I have to decide between these two. So what is the next experiment? Or should I pay for this observation? It costs lots of money. It involves a certain kind of study, right? All these are part of a scientist's everyday thinking.
So I mean, in what you're like experimental design is often about kind of which collection of experiments should you do. So are you talking about kind of a sort of adaptive version of experimental design that has
adapted and automated? As long as it's theory driven and automated, this is what we need to see. We need to program the management of attention.
So I mean, when people are, for example, drilling oil wells or other kinds of mining operations and so on, they're often like, they have sort of an algorithmic framework for thinking about where do we drill the next hole to get us the most information about what's, about whether there's an oil deposit in this area or not. And I think there's been a certain, but so what you have in mind is something where you are given a certain existing body of knowledge. You're asking what's the best next experiment to do to maximize the amount of additional information? Isn't that, I mean, like even in even when you're making KD trees and things like that, you're often saying what's the cut that I make in order to give me the maximum distinction between this side and that side?
Correct. Yes. There is a connection between the two, okay? But this is more involved because it's built on prior knowledge about causal knowledge, about the theory. You cannot talk about the next experiment unless you have a theory that tells you what you could expect from the result of that experiment. That is the idea of value of information. You can formalize value of information only have a theory that tells you what are the kind of output you expect from this kind of experiment or this kind of observation. Okay. So bringing this theory to bear gives you an automated scientist.
But so what you have in mind there is in a sense, by knowing the probability distribution, you can basically say, and I don't know if it's it's not quite maximum entropy, it's some other kind of thing that you're maximizing. You're saying if you make this next, if you ask this question next, you will most separate the probability. I mean, maybe you're dealing with discrete probabilities, but you'll most separate off you'll get the highest. There must be some criterion here that's
Yeah,
sort of
these are
based on
criteria.
entropy.
So that the decision that you make next, okay, will be most informative in the sense
Yes.
that it will have a highest chance of curing this particular patient. Okay, now notice that even the query, the highest chance of curing, is it's only 3 decades old to be able to formulate this question. Okay, maximize the chance that the consequences of your actions will be better. Okay, that kind of query, the result of your action, is new, only 3 decades old.
Yeah.
Didn't even enter yet.
But so when you think about this in terms of personalized medicine,
Yeah.
That's a place where, there's obviously one of the questions with personalized medicine is, the FDA has certain criteria for, how to approve some therapy or whatever else. If things are personalized, that becomes, the set of possibilities, astronomically increases. Is there a way in which you can think about, you say, okay, FDA, here's our Bayesian network. This is, how do you characterize? The traditional approach to doing clinical trials.
Okay, that's a whole new topic, personalized medicine or personal decision making. And I need to give you some introduction. Okay, there is a difference between approving a drug on the basis of a randomized experiment on a population and telling you how a particular individual would react to the drug. Okay, because I'll give you a simple example. Suppose in a randomized experiment you find that it has no effect on the population, which means the placebo and the drug have a 10% of curing in both cases, in both branches. Okay? You don't know if the drug has 0 effect on every individual or whether it cures 10% and kills some others. That you never know, which means an individual inside this population never knows whether he or she has a risk of being killed by virtue of taking the drugs. All you know is the population properties. Now we are going to change that. Now we are going to change that and talk about the individual response. What is the likelihood that this particular individual will benefit from the drug? Okay, so that's a new game altogether, and it involves counterfactual reasoning. Counterfactual takes you from the population level to the individual level. So it's a new calculus, and it's a new criterion. It's a new set of techniques, and I am a strong believer that we got a hold now of the ability to talk about an individual situation, individual customer, individual voter, which is a dangerous thing, okay? But this is within our reach now. And one more particular thing is to watch here, is that involves a combination of experimental data and observational data. Only by virtue of this combination, we get what each component cannot give us in isolation. And this is the knowledge about the behavior of an individual.
But so just to understand what this would mean, so as an individual, you've got your various characteristics, your age, your blood level of this, your et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You've got some vector of maybe 100 values, let's say,
correct,
that characterize, your medical state, so to speak. And now, and then somebody's going to do a trial, and they're going to, often in the trials that are done today, there's a huge amount of work that's done in kind of sculpting the population that actually goes into the trial, to be able to figure out, and that's often one of the sort of hidden statistics secrets or something of that kind of business, is not knowing exactly what the criteria were for the people in the trial, and and so on. But then everybody has this length 100 vector, let's say, that characterizes their medical state. You do a trial, and presumably, I mean, is that the idea? And for each person in the trial, you know their sort of medical vector, and then what do you do? Then the question that you want to ask is,
okay, the conventional way is take a subpopulation that resembles the individual as much as you can. They share with the individual a bunch of factors, age,
yes,
family history, so on. Okay? And calculate or conduct a randomized experiment on this subpopulation, see the difference between the treatment and the control arms, and that's the chance that individual will be cured.
Although in practice, you'll never get it down to the level, I mean, with a length 100 vector, so to speak, you'll never get, you might get male versus female, over 60, under 60, but you'll never get,
because there are hundreds of them. It's very hard. You have a very small number of samples in each cell, so you cannot generalize. But this is a problem for neural nets. They do it very well. They fit functions into sparse data.
Yes.
That, however, conceptually, I'm not talking about this. This is a conventional way. It's not about the individual. It's about a subpopulation that resembles the individual. And that's different from talking about this particular individual, Joe Schmo, right? Who comes to me, he's about to be on the operation table in about an hour. And I want to know if I should use this kind of knife or that kind of knife on him. Okay.
Right.
Now, what can I say about the individual? Okay. Not only about the subpopulation that resembles the individual, but on him. Okay. Now, that gives us a whole new kind of questions. How do we find it, and how can so the idea that now we can talk about the expected behavior of this individual, given all the rest of what we find in the subpopulation, in the various subpopulation. Okay? But talking about him and only him, whether he's going to be cured by the disease or killed by it, whether he's going to be a beneficiary of this kind of procedure or that kind of procedure, or what is degree of being in each one of these two categories. Don't care, will cure anyhow, cure only if not treated, or cured if and only if treated, or the other way around, okay? Right. 4 types of individuals. Okay? So now we can bound those kind of probabilities of being in each one of those categories and tell the individual, are you going to take the risk? Ask him or his family. Consult.
But how do you, I mean, in order to get to this point, are you putting in, I mean, do you imagine that there is some causal model in which certain things are believed to be true about the world independent of the statistical measurements? And then you're filling in statistical measurements.
This is one area where we do not rely on a man-made causal model.
Okay.
It comes from 2 sources of data. Only 2. One of them is a controlled randomized trial that you can conduct in certain population. And the second one is behavior of our individual act on their own volition when giving a chance. That's called observational data. Use a phone call, use a survey. Let them act according to their own volition or choice. Okay? Combine that with what you get from randomized experiment. So you combine observational data with experimental data. And that gives you what each component cannot give in isolation. And that is the behavior of an individual in the population.
But you're saying, hold on a second. I mean, in the medical case, in the case you just described where you're doing a survey by phone, that's one thing. But the medical case requires that you actually do you give the drug to this, in the usual model, you're just breaking into, let's say, 2 arms, a control arm and an active arm. In what you're proposing, as I understand it, is in addition to doing that, you have an experimental piece in which you are actively picking out. How does that work? I mean, because in the usual case, you would just be breaking the population in two or something.
Yes, in this case, we break it into two. Plus, we observe how these patients behave when they're given a choice to go and buy this treatment in the pharmacy.
But wait a minute. I mean, usually in drug trials and things, nobody knows. I mean, the scientists, the doctors, the patients, nobody really knows what's going to happen. It's some detail of, oh, this particular drug, had trouble getting cleared out by the kidneys and this, for this type of patient.
Suppose the drug is approved, okay?
Yes.
And now it's on the market, and patients have a choice whether to buy it in the pharmacy or not, okay? They hear all kinds of rumors. Say the drug has side effects, or I know my uncle died, or so on. And they form their own opinion and they decide whether to use it or not. Take a survey and look at what happened to people who chose the drug on their own volition and look at the outcome. Some of them died, some of them recovered, so on. Combine this with the data that you get under intervention, namely a randomized control experiment, where you force a person to take a drug because he or she is in a treatment arm. And then you force another one to take placebo or not a drug. You deny that person a drug. That under forced condition. You combine these two sources of data. Free choice, forced treatment. We have a calculus for combining them. And we get mileage that we couldn't get from each one individual.
That's interesting. So can you apply this? I mean, in modern times, let's take, a super controversial topic like vaccines for COVID. That's a case where people, where one can absolutely see this, there are trials that have been done. There are people choosing things. There's, a big database of things that people said went wrong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can you apply this in that case?
It should be. I don't have the resources to run the experiment. And I'm in a very hot debate with trialists who claim it will never work. It will never work. Okay, but I believe.
So what would you do experimentally? So you've got this case. You've got this vaccine. There's been, there've been the standard randomized clinical trial type things done.
Approved, and you have the result of the data that brought about the approval.
Right.
Okay, it's available. Okay.
Yep. Well, I mean, yes. Right. And you also have the observational fact that X% of people with certain characteristics have chosen to get the vaccine. Some have been forced to get the vaccine, and others have been able to freely choose whether to get it or not and have made one choice or another. And
plus the outcome. Those who chose, which one, whether they recovered, whether they got the COVID after how many months after. Okay, you have the data, which is called observational study, ordinary survey.
Right.
Free choice. Okay.
Okay. So now what do you do? So you've got this data. Assume that you actually have the data from. I mean, and let's say probably there is data on people who got seriously sick, taking the vaccine, not taking the vaccine because those are hospital admissions, and there's data on that, and so on.
Yeah.
So now you've got this data. You've got both the randomized clinical trial data, and you've got the free choice data from people who chose to get the vaccine or chose not to get the vaccine. Okay, so now what do you do? Now
I wouldn't go into the calculus, but I tell you the result. With these two inputs, I can tell you the probability that you are beneficiary of the drug, or the probability that you might be killed by the drug, which means it's going to harm you.
Why does it get you more information? I mean, in other words, the fact that I made a choice, why is that more information than a randomized trial?
Because you are familiar with your own system in some way.
Okay, so this is based on the idea that there is a sort of a separate variable, which is which wasn't getting randomized away, which is my self-assumption about that. That's very, I have to say, in the world of most of kind of the medical system, that seems like it's a very, it seems like a lot of the meta theory of medicine is don't believe that the patients know anything. And this is in a sense goes directly against that idea.
I know, but this is a ingredient that gives you this additional information, which enables us to go to the individual level. And
so the basic thing is sort of self-knowledge or perceived self-knowledge,
yes.
which might be based on having read some crazy conspiracy theory on the internet, or it might be based on...
Or it might be because your cousin got a side effect.
Yes, right.
Which is very important.
Yep.
Good. So, and you know it, or you hear the rumors about it. Okay.
Right.
And you're aware.
Well, it might also be the case that people in my, the conspiracy theory I'm reading is something relevant to people in my demographic, collection or whatever. And so, yes, it isn't. I mean, I'm curious.
We are not relying on them, which means if you have a wrong theory, it's also input. It's also an input that we can only utilize positively, informatively. Okay, we're not losing information by you obeying some conspiracy theory. It's never going to hurt us. Okay,
at a meta level, the main point you're making is the choices that patients make for themselves is an additional piece of information not being accounted for in, let's say, a phase 3 trial or something.
Correct.
That's a good point. I mean, it's what do people like, as I say, I would think that was kind of pretty, rather anathema to the medical kind of way of thinking about things, where it's like, the doctors know best type thing. I mean, have you?
It was not part of the mindset of the medical profession because it didn't have the calculus of counterfactuals.
I see.
And we are dealing now with it's necessary to have this calculus, which tells you what you would have done had you been under the placebo arm.
I think you need to get somebody to actually do this for the COVID vaccine thing. It's highly, I mean, the data must exist.
Absolutely. Data exists. But it's
either in the US or my impression is that Israel has been particularly on top of the data for this kind of thing.
Most probably because they have a centralized medical system. A socialized medical, yes.
But so when you take we should wrap up our discussion in a few moments. But I mean, when we take when you say you've not been that interested in sort of the applications that people make of the things you do, I'm curious when, have you generally adopted, and has it been successful for you to kind of write the paper and they will read it and they will use it type thing? Or have you ended up finding that you have to, I mean, clearly your book of Why, for example, is which I see. I've got the collection. I've got a few sample books here just to show that I haven't done my homework properly. I didn't. I'm curious how you found the kind of the sort of the theory of taking ideas that you have and getting them translated into actual implementation and so on. I mean, is that something that you've been, clearly the fact that you...
I don't know what your question relates to.
Well, I think my question is...
that I don't have the time to go and explain to, let's say, to Amazon, that if they want to optimize on the kind of advertisement that they are using, namely which cookies they are going to display, that they should use counterfactual. I don't have the time to go and explain to them. Okay, but it's so obvious that if you can deal with individual situations and choosing the right, the most convincible or swayable customer, okay, find the most swayable kind of customers is an issue that can save money to many companies.
But so some people, given an idea like that, there are different
Yes.
things people do. Like they might have a chain of students, and the students go and populate the world and educate the Amazons of the world and so on. Or they might be going off and doing consulting gigs, helping these these companies, or they might make software which they would then sell to these companies and so on. And have you adopted any of those strategies, or is it?
No. Unfortunately, I'm in the business of publishing a paper and hoping that some wise manager in Amazon will understand how profitable it can be. I've not been very successful. Or maybe they're using it already. Maybe it's already being used.
Yeah, they won't tell you. Nobody, you never find
That's
out.
right.
People who make tools never get told whether tools get used. It's purely very interesting. Well, let's see. What we've talked for a long time. Very interesting. What are there topics that we should have covered that we managed to miss here?
Yeah, the ladder of causation. That's the DNA of causal reasoning.
Okay, I better learn about that before I can't leave this conversation without learning about that.
Okay. No. When we talk about causal questions, they can be separated nicely and formally into three types. One is statistical. It's not even causal. Find the probability of Y given information about X. Conditional probability has a beautiful formula-based conditioning, being bang done. Okay, this is what machine learning is today. Now there is a higher level. The higher level is, what if I do? What if I force you to take placebo while you want to run to the pharmacy and buy the treatment? Okay? So that's it's called the interventional level. And then there is a higher level, which is counterfactual. What if a certain
What would have
event,
happened if?
what would have happened if what? If something which actually happened would not have happened. Had I attended this meeting, which I missed. I missed the train came late, I missed the meeting. What if the train came on time and I would attend that meeting?
Right.
Knowing the results of the meeting that took place without me, knowing what happened there. And that's very important. I know the consequences. I know the outcome. Now, how would the outcome change had I been in the meeting? So I'm undoing past events. That's a third level. Okay? These three levels constitute a hierarchy, which means you cannot solve a problem in level I unless you have information or experiment in level I or higher. Okay? And that's why we cannot, okay.
Well, so like the counterfactual that I was asking you earlier, if computers had been invented before people developed statistics, would they have come up with
beautiful?
Right.
Good question.
But I mean, one of the things that I wonder here is as you go to these different levels, how much external modeling is needed to be able to implement these levels?
We need to answer questions at this level.
Yes.
Okay. We need a different kind of input for each one of them. For statistics, all we need is data.
Mm-hmm.
Simple, good, nothing. For intervention, you need to have randomized experiments. Okay, of various kinds. And for counterfactual, you need more than randomized experiments. You need to have the functional relationship between the variables. Remember we had the Bayesian network? In the Bayesian network that we had with the fire, with the alarm and the burglary, we had probability table, not good enough. You have to have the functional relationship.
What do you mean by functional? You mean deterministic functional relationship?
Yeah, for instance, if we have an OR function, the alarm would have sound if that input or that input, that you have an OR function plus a random noise. Now we have a functional relationship.
But I mean, when you have those probability tables, you can think of those as being just like the full, joint probability distribution is an inefficient representation.
Not enough. The full probability distribution is not enough. Even the full interventional probabilities are not enough, which means all these are results of randomized experiment. Still not enough. You need to have the functional relationship between the variables.
Right. So I think I'm not able to decode this well enough in real time, but I think that if you go even further down that path, you would end up with these kind of multi-way systems. That is, if you say, because what you're saying is at each step, the question is, where are the probabilities coming in? Because at some point there are—
Because you put probability on exogenous variables.
Okay, but so within the system, everything is deterministic. Is that true?
Yes. Once you know the hidden variable or the exogenous variable, all the noise factors, okay? I'm going to give them a name, noise factor.
Okay.
The thing which I don't see, I don't know about, but they are responsible for the variability.
Okay, but in a picture where there's no probability, there basically are additional variables running around, and they have all kinds of deterministic functions by which they are connected to other variables. You've got a giant network where everything is deterministic. Every node is a deterministic function of its inputs, giving deterministic outputs.
Okay.
Then you say, let me take that network and let me hide parts of it.
Good. That's a good model of the creation of uncertainty, the origin of uncertainty.
Yeah. I'm going to claim that when you talk about noise, okay, that there is more information. When you have the original deterministic network, then you hide part of it. Now the question is, how do you parameterize the hidden part? And I'm claiming that when you say you just add noise, you're taking a particular model for that hidden part. And that model clearly isn't the complete model. That is, when you say there will be correlations, when you say there's noise here, there's two places where you insert noise, and you might say those noises are independent because they're just probabilities. But in reality, that hidden deterministic state has a correlation between those two places.
But if you don't assume independence, then you haven't eliminated. You haven't eliminated any information. You've done everything.
No, I agree. The point that I'm making is that I'm trying to climb to the next rung of your ladder. Okay, I'm trying to climb to the rung of your ladder.
Let's talk about a specific example. Okay, can we take the firing squad as an example? Firing squad is rifleman. If rifleman A or rifleman B shoot, the prisoner is dead.
Okay.
And there is a captain that gives them a signal.
Okay.
Okay.
So it's kind of a diamond-shaped graph.
Diamond shape, yes. Okay. Now it's deterministic. It's assuming that each rifleman is law-abiding and sober. Okay. Okay. Now we can ask interventional questions about it, and we can ask counterfactual questions. For instance, we know that the prisoner is dead. What if rifleman A would not have shot? Okay. Would he still be dead? That's a counterfactual question. Can we answer it from what input? From the deterministic, we cannot answer it. Because all you know, I'm sorry, deterministic. Yeah, if you have
can answer it. In that case, the answer is rifleman B fired.
Yeah. How do we know it's fired? Because the prisoner is dead. Somebody should be here, right? All these are, by the way, you cannot answer it in logic, in propositional logic. Try to do it. Because in propositional logic, the system is equivalent to the following one. Either everybody is true or everybody is false. To the truth table, right?
Yeah.
Either the four variables are true or the four variables are false. This is the logical equivalent logical representation, a truth table for every possible combination of the variables. You cannot
Right. I mean,
distinguish
the problem here is that really this thing is a program, not a static, you know.
You got it. You got it. It's a program, which means
Right.
rifleman A waiting for a signal from the captain, and the captain determined or assigned a value to his action. It's an assignment and not a proposition, and not a rule of law. Okay. Once we understand that, then we are in business. Now you can answer all counterfactual questions in this domain. But we have a calculus for doing that. Okay? So you give me any shape of relationship, deterministic relationship like that, any evidence, any happenings, truth value to certain variables, I can ask you counterfactual question, what if this event had not taken place? Now we can answer them.
So if I think about this as some kind of Boolean network in which there is essentially data flowing through the Boolean network, and at each node of the Boolean network, I have a function, a Boolean function, let's say.
Yeah.
Right? So what you're saying is, I mean, this is a somewhat different from your sort of probability type analysis. You're saying, given that I know, I mean, I can start coloring okay, so this Boolean network will have many possible colorings corresponding to its many possible space-time histories, effectively. If you think about the Boolean network as being laid out, you know, it'll have many histories, right? So you have the whole network, and then depending on and by the way, presumably it's the case, if I'm understanding the setup correctly, given the inputs at the top of the network, you completely determine the rest of the network.
Correct.
Okay. So you might not, I spent some decent part of my life studying these things called cellular automata, which work in very much this way. So they have the feature that I have to show you. Okay, I'll show you just for 1 second, I'll show you my all-time favorite science discovery, just because I have to. Let me see if I can pull this up. All right, because this is not irrelevant to what you're talking about, I think. Okay, so
the connection would be what kind of questions you ask the system.
Right. So here, let me show you my all-time favorite science discovery, and then we can talk about. Okay, so this is a system where you've got a line of cells, each one is black or white. There's a rule that says, based on the color of the cell and its neighbors, what will the color of the cell be on the next step? Okay.
Yeah.
So the big surprise is, even though you started off from just one black cell, even though the rule is as simple as that, it makes this very complicated pattern.
But it's all determined on the rules and the top and the root.
Top, yes.
Yeah.
And the initial condition. That's all. Now, as I understand it, that's the same kind of setup that you're talking about. Is that right?
Let me just see. Yeah.
Okay, so now what you might be asking is, if I were to, you might be saying, if I know, let's see if I can find this, I might even have an example here. Let me see, if I'm lucky. Okay, so this is asking, can you reconstruct, let me see a better example here. Yeah, here we go. So this is now asking, if you see certain things after some number of steps, can you reconstruct what was going on elsewhere? In other words, if you see the prisoner is dead at the end, what can you say about what must have happened before?
Oh, more than that. If you see the prisoner is dead at the end, what if this square was black? But you say it couldn't be black because obeying the rule, it must have been white. I'm saying you break the rules. I break the rules now because I'm saying, what if the rifleman refrained from shooting, even though he got the signal from the captain? I break the rules.
Okay, so I'm not understanding this. I mean, what I was understanding was you have a Boolean network and you can ask the question, if you see certain things in the Boolean network, if you see certain output in the Boolean network, then you can make certain inferences deterministically, or you can make certain inferences. They might not be deterministic. It might be that the things you've seen completely determine the rest of the network. It might be, they might be enough to completely determine the rest of the network, or they might not be. Or it might be the case that the thing you saw was still left a bunch of undetermined features of the rest of the network.
Why are they undetermined in your case, in the case of the cellular automata?
Okay, so in the cellular automaton, if I share that again, what I was showing here was the forward evolution. If I start
before the
with this,
evolution, yeah.
the forward evolution is absolutely determined. Okay, so in other words, given an initial state, we absolutely know what's going to happen next. Right? Because we have that rule that just says the color of this cell based on the colors of the cell before it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this particular example is saying, assume we only know the colors of these cells in the center column.
What can we tell about the rest of the
right, exactly.
game? Yeah.
So in this, that means in this particular case, this is showing if we know two neighboring columns, then we completely determine everything to the left.
Yeah.
And this is showing we determine some amount of, if we have less information about the center column, we determine a certain amount about what's on the left, but some of it just has a certain probability.
Yeah.
Is this the same kind of thing you're talking about, or is this?
No, it's different. I'm talking about the rule breaking.
Okay. So that I have,
I started with law-abiding riflemen, and then I say, what if a rifleman A was trigger happy?
Okay.
I break the rule. Still, it will determine what happened to the prisoner, right?
Well, but sort of all bets are off. If you thought you had certain rules, and then you say, well, actually, the riflemen might turn on each other and shoot each other or something, and then the prisoner would, would survive or something. And
you have rule-breaking rules, which means you can only break rules locally. If you ask the question, what would happen if had rifleman A fallen asleep? You assume that all the rest of the system remains intact according to the prescribed rules.
I see.
Right? Okay. That's called the minimized change. Yeah.
Like in an error correcting code or something, there's a 1-bit error. There's one place where something goes wrong.
Correct. Yeah.
And so then the question is, if you have those, what is the type of question? Is it from what 1-bit errors can have an effect or what?
Yeah. This is how we communicate. I'll give you an example. If I say, if Cleopatra had a different nose, history of the world would have changed. Okay. But and you can figure out what Julius Caesar wouldn't fall in love with her. So you can start figuring out what happened. Right? But it's locally. You mean only her nose changed, not the character of Antonius, of Octavius, not everything else that we know about history. Only her nose. That's what is the idea of localized counterfactuals. The interpretation of counterfactual must be relative to a local change in the model that you have. It cannot be everything else also change. Okay, the weapon system changes. It's not. When we interpret counterfactual, if I say, had the train arrived in time, I would have made it to the meeting and we would made a big sale. I mean, the only thing that I'm allowed to change in the universe is the train arriving in time. All the rest must remain intact. Okay.
So, I mean, to take a naive case, if the world was linear, if all relationships were linear, then that one change will produce just this superposition. You'll just superpose the effect of that change, and everything else will be the same. So the fact that this is a non-trivial problem is a consequence of the fact that the world is not. If there was just linearity, if every variable, if you just said you change this variable, you add 0.1 to this variable.
I don't buy the linearity in the case. Even if the function is no linearity, you still have to make a certain relationship invariant to the change. Certain mechanisms are stable. are invariant to changes in other mechanisms. That's what we mean by invariant, that's what I mean by stability. The behavior of rifleman man A is different than the behavior of rifleman B, and they are independent. One can
Right.
fall asleep with the other one, okay? And the behavior of the prisoner, given the bullets, is independent of how the rifleman listened to the captain. So these are different mechanisms. And that is the idea behind counterfactual. You must have this idea.
But I mean, once something has happened, there is a kind of cone of consequences from that.
Right. But only from that consequence, not the past. The past remains the same.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, that is important here. Yeah.
Right. But so what you're saying is, if I mean, you're describing kind of a way of approaching things where you say, if we make one change, then you have a calculus for describing the consequence of one change, so to speak.
Correct.
Okay, that's interesting. That's I mean, I'm trying to think what that. I mean,
you're looking for application for that. I'll tell you.
No, I'm trying to just fit it into things I know. I mean, like error correcting codes are one example of where you kind of understand the effect of a one-bit change. But I mean, also
think about action. When I tell you, paint the wall red, okay, I do not mean that you paint the wall red and you go and murder your cousin. I meant only do that and only that. So the whole conversation about actions and intervention relies on this locality.
Right, except that there might be some model of the world where, as you were saying before, once you've painted the room red, that has inevitable consequences.
Consequences, yes, but the past remains the same.
Fair enough.
And also the life of your cousin remains the same, because he's not connected consequentially to the color of the room.
Right, but I mean, the things that might be affected by the kind of forward cone of effects from painting the room, you don't necessarily know what those will be.
Oh, why not? If you have a model, you know.
Okay, if you have a model, you know.
Yeah.
I see. Well, very interesting. Okay. Well, it's okay. So we reached the top. I hope the temporary top, at least, of this ladder. So that's probably a sign that we should wrap this up. And it's very interesting, and appreciate all of the.
Thank you very much for taking the time to interview Humble Me, and I'm really greatly honored by the opportunity to talk to my alma mater, should I say, Martin, the AI in mathematics. By the way,
I'm glad we had a chance.
The conference, that my first paper on counterfactual was published in the Proceedings of AI in Mathematics in 19, I don't know, maybe 18.
How many papers are you up to by now? How many papers have you, or do you not count?
I think about 500.
Oh my gosh, very impressive. But
I count here joint papers and student papers, and about 500, yes.
Well, let's see. I don't know. I think we probably should wrap up here. I was thinking how do we end here?
We end
Marty,
with a
thank you for setting this up. This was very interesting for me, at least.
Thank you. I knew you're going to lead me into proper path that I wanted to walk through. Okay, not the path not taken, but the path that I wanted to go to. It's another concept in counterfactual. Yeah.
Right. Yes, the we're right. I was not exercising too many counterfactuals of yes. Well, anyway, well, very
this
good.
has been wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, we should wrap up. Okay. So I'm I guess your conference is probably ending, and my gosh, we've been going a long time here. Well,
This
great
was the
to
high point.
chat.
Yes, I don't. I hate to see it end.
On behalf of the organizers of the
You are.
conference, thank you both very, very much for this really long and interesting interview. It could have gone even longer because I see that both of you have lots of energy to continue going further. But after 3 hours, I think the audience will be happy to take a break. But if you want to continue again at another opportunity, we're happy to set it up for another 3 hours.
Wow,
Okay.
3 hours. The time
I don't
flew.
know. It went very quickly, yes.
3.5
Yes,
hours.
Yeah. Yes,
right.
it
Thank you
did.
very much, Steve. I
Okay,
really
thank
appreciate it.
you. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.